Welcome, fellow sapiens. Dim the lights, let your shoulders loosen, and let your breath find an easy, even tide. This is slow, evidence-first storytelling for sleepy yet curious minds. We'll move carefully, with sources where possible, and humility where needed. If you find value here, consider subscribing and tell us how and when do you listen. Drifting to sleep, commuting, cooking, or working quietly with a warm cup beside you. Timestamps are in the description so you can find your way back. Now, let's begin. It is very early on a shoulder of the greater Caucasus. Night has not quite surrendered, but the sky is thin over the southern ridges, a pale seam where day will enter. The slope under your boots is a mosaic. Patches of oak and hornbeam, open glades brushed with thyme, damp threads of spring-fed grass that stitch upward toward the scree. Somewhere below, a river mutters behind alders. Above, a goat bell counts a slow rhythm you can almost match to your breath. You kneel at a small hollow scooped into a patch of fine soil where the wind collects leaves. Your fingertips lift a flake, obsidian, glassy, black, and beside it a duller chip of chert, still wearing the faint ripples of a careful strike. Neither is large, both are exact. A little forward, half buried in the dark earth, sits a pottery sherd the size of your palm. Its surface is buff and soft to the touch, not yet the hard sheen of later ages. Turn it in the dim light, and a faint impression, perhaps from a woven mat or a fingertip, scuffs the slip. A pot and a blade, side by side. It is a modest still life, easy to miss, but it points to a broader, quieter truth. As the slope brightens, the path splits. One trail angles up towards summer pastures, the kind goats carve into terraces with their hooves and shepherds learn by body memory. Another curls down, toward a river fan where, in certain years, cereals will grow if the floods are kind and the silt is deep. The air carries two smells at once, resin from juniper warming in the first light, and a ghost of smoke from last night's hearth, spiced with something fatty and sweet that clung to the pot and flared when the fire woke. In such places, over thousands of mornings between roughly 7,000 and 4,500 BCE, life ways braided rather than collided. A family might keep a handful of goats and a small plot near a spring, yet spend long weeks on the ridge nets for partridge or in the beech woods for mast and deer. A neighbor might travel a pass to trade obsidian cores for a sack of grain, then follow streams to a salmon run when the moon was right. The corridor offered choices, and people kept more than one open at a time. Listen for the soft evidence that these choices leave. Pots, even fragmentary, sometimes hold lipid ghosts, fatty acids soaked into their walls by stews of milk and meat. Teeth grown in childhood carry strontium signatures from the bedrock bit where a person drank and ate while they were small. Bones, remade year by year, remember the last seasons of life. Carbon and nitrogen and collagen sketch diets in broad strokes. C3 plants of temperate valleys, fish from cold rivers, meat and milk from pastures brushed with alpine herbs. None of these measures sing alone. Together they form a chord, quiet but reliable, that places bodies in landscapes and meals on tables. We will spend time with those chords later. For now, let the scene do the teaching. To your left, the path to the uplands shows recent traffic. Hoofprints press into damp clay where a spring seeps. A few are small, wade light, kids pulled along by a rope. A braided tether lies coiled near a flat stone blackened by use, a place where milk may have warmed in a pot whose lip shows a faint, greasy line. The sherd in your palm could be from such a vessel. If it remembers milk fat, we will find out later, in the lab, one molecule at a time. To your right, the path down carries different traces. A scatter of charred barley grains lies in a shallow scoop of earth, perhaps a storage pit opened and cleaned, perhaps a hearth raked after a damp fire. The grains are small by modern eyes, but they are seeded promise. Nearby, a grinding stone, one face smooth to a gentle saddle, rests under a fallen branch. Your thumb finds the curve where hands have worked for years. The stone is heavy, fixed in use yet portable by patient people who know how to move labor across seasons and places. In the half-light, a figure appears on the slope above, a woman with a basket balanced by a headband, a walking stick in hand. She pauses at a juniper, plucks a handful of berries, and tucks them into the basket's mouth. The stick taps the ground in a rhythm that reads the slope's grammar. Here step wide, there plant the pole, there listen for water. Her path crosses yours and she nods, eyes slipping to the sherd in your hand, then to the goat prints, then to the river's fog. Nothing here belongs entirely to one story. This is the corridor in practice. Mountains and seas narrow movement into lines that knot at passes, fans, and mouths of rivers. Along those lines, people borrow. Foragers learn the patience of sowing and weeding in patches where wild intended blur. Herders learn the timing of runs and mast years, the craft of nets and traps as insurance against thin milk. If change comes, it comes unevenly, by households, by valleys, by practical experiments repeated until they become habit. Our central question tonight is simple to ask and slow to answer. In these 1,000 years, was the shift to farming in the Caucasus a replacement or a mosaic? Did fields push hunters aside? Or did families compose mixed economies tuned to altitude, season, and risk? We will follow tools, pots, bones, bonds, and molecules. We will mark where consensus is steady and where debate remains lively. We will resist smooth stories that the land does not support. As the sun finally catches the ridge, you pocket the sherd and the small obsidian flake, not to keep, but to carry a few steps to a flagged square where they can be recorded with care. Ethics matter here. People's ancestors walked these paths. Their descendants do now. Where sampling is destructive, we do it with permission, with restraint, and with an eye toward questions that justify what is lost. Take one more breath. Juniper, damp soil, a hint of smoke. 2 trails, 2 lifeways, and a long coexistence that makes room for both. In the next part, we'll open the map, ridges, passes, coasts, and trace the corridors that made this mosaic possible. Unfold the map slowly, as if it were a skin of the land itself. The Caucasus is not a single wall, but a braided pair. The greater range to the north, steep and glaciated, and the lesser range to the south, softer in outline, volcanic in places, cupping high basins like still bowls. Between and around them lie corridors, banages, wide where rivers relax, narrow where ridges pinch, that focus human movement into repeatable paths. In the early and middle Holocene, between roughly 7,000 and 4,500 BCE, these paths stitched communities into a gradient rather than a boundary. Begin with altitude. Imagine 4 broad belts that run, with local quirks, from sea to summit. First, the lowlands, river mouths and coastal plains where alluvium renews thin soils and reeds rim backwaters. On the Black Sea side, think of the Colchis plain, humid and green. On the Caspian side, long, lower reaches with salt-tinged air and big skies. Second, the Piedmont, oak and hornbeam forests on rolling toes of mountain, dotted with springs and open glades. Third, the subalpine, beach thinning to meadows threaded with cold, bright water. Fourth, the high pastures and rock, short summers, long horizons, herbs that perfume milk. A family could, within a day or two of walking, move from barley-suitable flats to goat-bright meadows. That vertical closeness, ecologies stacked like shelves, makes mixed economies sensible. Grain low, mast and game mid, milk and meat high. The land offers a portfolio. People learn to diversify. Set the rivers on this map and they become sentences the whole region reads. From west to east along the Black Sea face, the Rioni runs broad. The Nguri and Kadori come down fast from the greater Caucasus. North of the backbone, the Terek and Sulak cut out toward the Caspian. To the southeast, the Kura and its tributaries, like the Alazani, gather water from both ranges and drain a long interior. Rivers do more than carry water. They carry silt that makes small fields possible on their fans. They cut passes and gorges where paths can thread. They host runs of fish that seasonally anchor camps. Now mark the passes. The Darial, where the Terek squeezes through, the Mamison, higher and softer in summer, low saddles in the Liki, Sarami range that connect the Black Sea's damp to the Kura's drier basin, corridors through southern uplands toward today's Armenia and eastern Anatolia. In winter, many of these close or narrow to a risk calculus. In late spring, they open like valves. Over centuries, hooves and feet engrave choices into habit. Add stone to the map, not as cliffs, but as sources. Obsidian nodules ring volcanic districts. Chikiani, Paravani on high plateaus to the south. Gutanzer and Artini farther east, other lenses tucked into lesser Caucasus flows. Glassy cores move readily in pockets and bags. Blades travel lighter than the meals they make possible. When we later meet an obsidian flake far from its source, we'll consider 2 stories at once. that of a traveler who carried it and that of a path sturdy enough, socially and physically, to make carrying it worthwhile. Clay belongs on the map too. Not all clays fire the same, and not all tempers, sand, crushed shell, plant ash, behave alike. Where communities learn to shape and fire pots, they also learn where to gather good clay and what routes carry their vessels without turning them to sherds. Pottery appears unevenly across this landscape. In some valleys, early, unambitious vessels sit beside older, stubborn stone tools. We will later read fat soaked into those pots, but for now, place them as tokens of meals that learn to linger. Milk warmed, stews simmered, seeds softened. The coastal edges deserve their own quiet look. On the Black Sea rim, wetlands and back swamps complicate movement but offer birds, fish, reeds, and shelter from wind. Along the Caspian's western shore, low terraces and brackish margins change as shorelines wobble with Holocene water levels. These places can feel peripheral on modern road maps. In lifeways tuned to seasonal abundance, they are centers that move with time of year. Nets, not furrows, make more sense here for longer than neat narratives allow. Consensus among archaeologists is broad on the physical logic of this map. The ranges and belts, the key rivers, the main passes, these are agreed bones of the region. Where views diverge is how quickly new habits, tending cereals, herding caprines, shaping pots, traveled along these bones, and which corridors mattered most when. Some scholars emphasize south to north seepage from the southern flanks and eastern Anatolia into the Kura Basin, with innovations pausing and reforming in interior bowls before cresting the greater range. Others stress Black Sea rims and interior crosscuts, arguing for multiple small fires kindled locally rather than one big flame spreading. Our episode will keep both possibilities alive until the evidence resolves them in specific valleys and dates. Overlay climate gently. The early and middle Holocene favored forests in many piedmont zones. Mid-Holocene warmth opened longer windows on high pastures. Neither effect was uniform. Moisture gradients differ between west and east. Local rain shadows and basin effects mean two neighboring valleys may offer different menus in the same decade. That patchiness protects coexistence. Where one belt falters, another fills in. Where a grain plot fails in a cool, short summer, goats convert herbs into milk. Where a mast year booms, hunting and gathering become more attractive even for households that keep small fields. The corridor is not a line, but a net. Resilience comes from the multiple ways to hold it. Put people on the paths, slowly. Think of short-range circuits first. A household moving between low field and mid-slope grove, between grove and nearby summer meadow. Then layer in medium circuits. A cousin bringing obsidian nodules from a plateau to trade for salt or clay. A marriage tie that pulls one person across a pass with gifts in a woven bag. Finally, the long threads. Rare, but memorable. Downriver drift of a pot form. Uphill adoption of a herd management trick. A new weed in a valley field that hints at seed moved with grain. Replacement narratives, one way of life crowding another out, tend to draw long, bold arrows. The lived map is paler, more braided, but also sturdier over time. You can hear this in season words, though we'll avoid later terms that come with fixed systems. The logic is simple. When the grass is green high, animals bulk milk. When rivers thin and slow, fish stack in pools. When acorns and beech nuts fall, pigs and people fatten together. A community that knows these clocks can tune effort across belts, which is what we mean by a mosaic of niche sharing. Farming is a component, not a banner. Herding is a choice, not an identity. Foraging remains a skill, not a remnant. Finally, mark the places where archaeology speaks best and least. Caves and rock shelters preserve hearths and tools under protective roofs. Open-air camps and hamlets on fans and terraces can be rich but fragile, their records thinned by flood and plow. Wetlands hoard wood and seed and oxygen pour quiet, yet they also shift, erasing edges. Later road building, terrace cutting, and modern cultivation patch the record with absences hard to see from the surface. Our map therefore includes not only ridges and rivers, but also windows of preservation and curtains of loss. Reading it well means patience, and a willingness to say, we don't know yet, where the land has closed a file. Hold the map in your mind. Belts stacked, rivers riding, passes opening, sources glinting, climates breathing, people moving, near, far, and back again. In such a landscape, long coexistence is not surprising. It is the path of least resistance. In the next part, we'll step from the map into places on the ground, camps, hamlets, and way stations, and listen for how daily movement made the gradient real. Step down from the ridge into the places where ordinary days left quiet marks. The first is a rock shelter tucked under a pale limestone lip, dry even in steady rain, dark enough at noon to deepen the fire's color. On the floor, thin lenses of ash and charcoal stack like pages. A scatter of microliths sits near a low wall of stones that once braced a windbreak. Bone splinters, light and angled, speak of small game and fish. A caprine metapodial, larger and cleaner cut, suggests a goat whose meat moved here rather than a herd that lived here. This is a way station, a place good for 2 nights, for mending nets and drying meat, for listening to water and to hoof-fall upslope. People come back, not as owners, but as readers who know where the lines of shelter and fuel cross. Follow the slope down to a fan where a small stream exits a tight cleft and spreads its load on softer ground. Here the evidence changes register. Post holes, circular and paired, arc across a patch of subsoil like punctuation. Between them, a shallow hearth scorched a dun oval onto the earth, and to one side a pit holds charred grains and cracked nutshell. Thin walls once rose here, wattles smeared with clay, roofed in reeds or brush. A few meters away, a clay platform bears a smear of red slip and the faint impress of basketry. The plan is not rectilinear in the way later villages often are. It is rounded, adaptable, easy to repair. A hamlet, not a town. A place where morning work begins with a decision. Fields today if the flood was kind, a short walk to a mast-rich grove if the beech and oak are talking, a trail toward the summer meadow if the milk has been thin. Across the region, such ground plans vary more than tidy typologies suggest. In some piedmont basins, early hamlets favor round or oval buildings with packed earth floors and central hearths, sometimes clustered around open yards with fire-darkened soil and shallow bins. Elsewhere, shallow semi-subterranean rooms insulate a few families against damp and heat. Pottery appears unevenly. Thicker, friable cooking jars with simple rims in one valley. Thinner, better levigated wares with light burnish in another. The tools mix too. Retouched blades for cutting plant stalks, ground stones for grain, but also barbed points, bolus stones, and net sinkers that belong beside fast water. No single kit owns the scene. The rhythm of movement ties these places to one another. Think in circuits. A short circuit, a few households move between a low hamlet and a mid-slope rock shelter, taking advantage of mushrooms after rain, chub, and barbel on summer evenings, and a patch of einkorn and barley that anchors the year. A medium circuit. In late spring, kin lead 20 or 30 goats up to pastures where snow withdraws in clean arcs, leaving herbs that thicken milk. They go light, felted cloaks, a pair of portable grinding stones, a small jar patched 3 times that will warm milk and carry a faint signature of its fats in those clay walls. After 6 weeks, they fold back toward the hamlet with kids bleeding and skins heavy with butter and curds. A long circuit, less frequent but present. Someone crosses a pass with obsidian cores wrapped in leather and returns with a lump of salt, a new rim form learned from a cousin's in-laws, or a story about a marsh where reeds grow tall and sweet. Archaeology hears these circuits in different keys. In shelters, hearths are small, replaced rather than enlarged, with discrete dumps of fish bone and bird. At hamlets, hearths grow, floors are resurfaced, and pits are dug and refilled. We find dog burials near doorways in some places, or caprine dung mats that testify to animals kept close on bad nights. At summer stations, the evidence is lighter, tethering pegs driven into turf, small fire spots, a ring of stones that once cradled a pot, trampled patches where hoof and foot blurred together in damp soil. Preservation favors the sheltered, and the wet, of course, and our picture inherits those biases. Rivers keep wood and seed in oxygen-poor silts. Wind-scoured ridges keep chips of stone longer than they keep baskets and skins. We mark these skews in our notebooks and resist tidy balances that the land cannot support. Inside the hamlet, the day is practical. A hearth rimmed in stone carries a steady boil. A child leans a stick across the rim to stop the lid from rattling. On a mat, a woman grinds a small heap of grain with a saddle quern, pushing and pulling the handstone until the flour mounds in a soft drift. Near the doorway, a net dries, its knots tightened with a bone gauge. In a corner, a goat kid naps in a woven pen while an older animal noses a basket of chaff. On a shelf, a jar with a nibbled lip holds something that smells pleasantly sour. If we could sample that jar's interior centuries later, we might find traces of milk fats, ruminant signatures that match caprines, or a blend with porcine fat from a boar hunted when the mast was thick. We might find beeswax too, a hint at sealed lids and sweeteners, though that is rarer and arrives unevenly. These are not inventions, they are possibilities the materials allow. We will test them properly when we reach our methods and evidence parts. Consensus is steady that many South Caucasus lowlands and interior basins saw early tending of cereals and herding of sheep and goats during this window, while foraging skills and resources persisted in parallel, especially in uplands and along watery margins. The gradient is not a placeholder for ignorance, it is a pattern in the finds. Minority views argue for quicker, more decisive shifts in certain valleys, clean breaks where pottery and domesticates appear together, and local foraging drops sharply. Those cases deserve attention. Sometimes a corridor tightens and a habit crystallizes fast. But across the ranges, the quieter, longer coexistence fits better with the full, uneven record. Listen for social glue. Feasts make sense where paths cross. A cull of kids and a pot of grain cooked into something thick, shared with cousins returning from a plateau with new stone. Gifts travel the same routes as news. A polished bead of soft stone, a carved antler haft, a jar traded not for its contents, but for the vessel itself. A novelty that invites imitation. Such objects are not just tokens of style, they are tools for stitching households into wider nets, the way passes stitch valleys. When a hamlet adopts a new rim profile or paste recipe, it may be copying a neighbor, but it may also be copying a relationship, a way to be seen as connected, competent, part of a corridor. Ethical note, many of the details we aim to recover, what those jars held, who those children were, require techniques that sample the past in ways that cannot be undone. When bones, teeth, and sherds are small and few, our responsibility is to ask precise questions, to design minimal, high-yield sampling, and to work with local communities whose histories and lands hold these traces. Curiosity does not outrank custodianship. At the edges of the hamlet, the corridor is visible in footprints. Some head toward the grove where pigs root under beech, some toward a line of poles that mark a fish weir, others to a slope where goats have learned a routine. Up in the morning, down by late light, bells making a music that becomes the calendar. A boy jogs after them, a sling at his waist, a handful of clay bullets in a pouch. A woman calls him back to carry a jar to the spring. An older man walks out with a forked stick to reset a trap. These are the small negotiations by which mixed lifeways persist. Not a standoff between identities, but a choreography of tasks chosen from a larger menu the land provides. What binds camp to hamlet to pasture is not architecture so much as timing. Plant, weed, check the weir, watch the sky, move the herd, mend the net, skim the pot, sleep light, and get up early. Replacement would feel different, abrupt, singular, intolerant of alternatives. The corridor, by contrast, rewards plural competence. That is why the gradient holds for centuries. It is robust to small shocks, adaptive to short summers, forgiving when fields drown or forage thins. In the next part, we'll open the pantry and the pot, grain, acorn, fish, and listen for the mixed table that fed this choreography. Open the pantry of an early Holocene household, and you meet a palette more varied than simple labels allow. On the low shelf, a basket of small, tough barley and einkorn kernels, their husks rubbed free on a coarse mat. In a clay jar, acorns leached until the bitterness slackened, then dried to keep. Hanging from a peg, a braided string of river fish, smoked to a translucent bronze. On a flat stone near the doorway, a handful of hazelnuts and beech mast, cracked and tested for mold. In the corner, where air moves but mice hesitate, a skin bag heavy with curds set from warm milk. This is not a pantry that declares allegiance to one lifeway. It is a set of answers to changing days. Begin with grain, the quiet backbone when seasons cooperate. Early cereals here are small by our eyes, stubborn to thresh and winnow, and uneven in yield. But they answer to a logic the corridor supports. Flood fans refreshed by silt, small plots that a few people can clear with digging sticks and light ards, harvests that can be carried home by hand. You can hear grain in the sound of a saddle quern, a steady push and pull as the handstone rides the shallow channel, releasing a smell that is part grass, part warm stone. The flour is coarse, good for porridge and flat cakes. If a charred kernel survives a fire or a pit-lining smolder, it may endure for thousands of years, carbonized, black, and legible under a microscope. We will meet those kernels later again, as witnesses with precise dates. Grain draws tools around itself. Sickles with inset blades, microliths hafted into wooden spines, leave gloss where silica-rich stalks polish their edges. Grinding stones polish too, not as shine, but as a smoothness the palm can tell from a lifetime away. Pits line with clay to keep damp out. Baskets get tight lids. Harvest is not a single event either. Ears ripen unevenly. People return to low plots and passes, gleaning where wind and birds missed ahead. In poor years, grain is a promise more than a sufficiency, and that is why the rest of the pantry matters. Turn to the trees, whose massed economies are as old as the squirrels. Acorns thick on a year, when rains came right and late frosts stayed gentle. Beechnuts with their papery shells. Chestnuts in some districts, hazel in others. Bitter acorns can be coaxed toward sweetness by patience, cracked, pounded, then leached in running water until tannins thin and perfumes rise. A woven bag of meal can be sunk in a stream overnight and found paler, kinder to the tongue in the morning. Mixed with barley flour, acorn meal makes a hearty cake, less elastic than pure grain, more forgiving of lean harvests. Pigs read these trees as closely as people do, and a fat autumn turns both bellies and social calendars. More feasts, more smoke, more bones cracked for marrow and boiled for broth. Listen to the river. In summer shallows and autumn pools, fish hold like commas in the sentence of water. A weir of woven hurdles funnels them toward baskets. Barbed points find the larger ones. Simple nets lift the rest. Smoked fish travel well to shelters and summer stations, where milk ebbs and flows with pasture. Dried roe is a salt of its own. Fish is not just food in itself. It is a gap filler when grain runs thin and mast arrives late. If we later sample collagen from human bone, we may hear fish in raised nitrogen values, though the signal will be a chord influenced by meat, milk, and the landscape's own baselines. For now, the household cooks what the season offers. A pot pebbles with the sound of a gentle boil. A child peels hot skin from a small trout with quick fingers. Milk belongs on the table, but softly at first. Early herding in these valleys likely began as meat on the hoof and hair to weave, then widened to milk as people learned timings, when to take, how to let kids and lambs keep enough, how to process quickly before warmth turns virtue into spoilage. Curds set with plant rennet or acidic herbs. Soft cheese pressed with stones. A sour drink that eases digestion. Milk is a risk in warmth, a boon in cool air. It ties households more tightly to animals' health, and to the meadows that perfume their milk. In pots used for warming or simmering milk, fatty acids seep into clay walls and linger as ghosts we can later retrieve. We will be careful with those ghosts, matching them to ruminants rather than pigs or people, weighing mixtures, and acknowledging where fire and time blur edges. Seeds and greens do quiet work in the margins. Chenopodium and amaranth sprout where soils are disturbed. Wild peas cling to hedges. Onions fatten in damp edges. Children know where to look for sorrel's sour bite and for the soft centers of young thistles. These are flavors as much as calories, and their archaeological record is often faint. Charred seeds and hearth rakeouts, imprints and daub, a pollen spike in a core taken from a nearby marsh. When we find them, we weigh them not as proof of farming or foraging, but as strands in the rope of a diet that plats both. Salt and smoke preserve abundance into lean. A frame over the hearth turns fish and meat slowly through a low cloud. A shallow pit becomes an ash cooler for nuts and cakes. A jar sees its mouth sealed with a disc of bark bedded in beeswax. A hamlet that does this well buys time for decisions, whether to replant after an early flood, whether to send extra hands to a mast grove, whether to move herds sooner to a snow-receded shelf. Preservation is strategy made tangible. Consensus among researchers is that such mixed tables persisted widely in the Caucasus corridor through 700 BC, even as domestic cereals, caprines, and pottery spread. The balance differs by valley and decade, but the repertoire stays broad. A minority view frames some basins as pivoting fast, grain and milk swiftly eclipsing acorn and fish, with foraging shrinking to ritual or emergency. There are places where the record suggests sharp turns, and we will mark them when we arrive. Yet the broader pattern, especially where altitude stacks choices within walking distance, is coexistence sustained by practical pluralism. Uncertainty box, brief for now. How much fish was on the human table versus fed to dogs or traded? Lipid residues in pots rarely catch fish oils well. Isotopes can point but not name species. Otoliths and vertebrae preserve unevenly. Did acorn leaching leave residues we can reliably see? Imprints and phytoliths help, but fire erases as much as it records. How early and how common was milk processing into cheese and yogurt, which changed the molecular traces we hope to read? We will return to each of these with methods in hand. Ethical note: the desire to reconstruct meals is intimate. It touches ancestors' bodies and the vessels that once sat in living rooms, like the one we just visited. Sampling sherds for absorbed residues removes slivers that will not grow back. Drilling teeth and ribs for isotopes and proteins takes what cannot be returned. Our rule is narrow questions, minimal sampling, and open reporting in the languages and forms of the communities whose histories we touch. Sit with the sensory hole for a moment. A cake sears and lifts, leaving a pale circle on the hot stone. A small fish hisses where a drop of fat finds flame. A curd breaks clean under a finger and tastes of meadow herbs and smoke. A child cracks a nut and laughs when a squirrel scolds from the roof. The day's labor and the land's tempos meet in a meal that is neither wild nor domestic as a flag, but human as a habit. Do what works, keep what keeps you. From such tables, habits grow. Sowing a little more next year, saving a better seed head. Fencing a plot against goats that learn too quickly. Shifting a weir a few steps when the channel migrates. The corridor rewards small experiments that do not close doors. Mixed menus are not indecision, they are resilience learned from ridges and rivers. In the next part, we'll follow the goat bells up the slope, caprines on the stair, and watch how seasonal herding stitched households to altitude and time. Follow the bells. They sound like water caught in metal, a light, irregular music that keeps time with hooves. Dawn lays a cool hand on the slope as goats thread upward, single file, noses testing air that still remembers snow. A boy walks behind with a forked stick and a sling. A woman moves ahead, scanning for the first tongue of meadow where herbs gather like a recipe. Thyme, bed straw, a bitter gentian that will steep into a cure. This is not a march to a distant elsewhere. It is a climb within reach of home, a daily translation from piedmont to pasture and back again when the light leans long. Transhumance, though we borrow the later word cautiously, is a simple grammar learned by steps. Low in winter, mid-slope in spring, high in summer, and back in a slow braid with autumn. In the Caucasus corridors between roughly 7,000 and 4,500 BCE, sheep and goats stitched this grammar into households. Goats lead, sheep follow with their lower edged bleats and tighter flocking. The root is a living memory, a particular alder to skirt because stones loosen under it after rain, a notch that bottlenecks and teaches patience, a spring that coughs back to life in late May. Ringed by tufts, the animals will clip to a close nap by noon. Children absorb these details by walking them until legs and lungs know the timing without speech. At day's crest, the herd blooms into a meadow newly freed by retreating snow. The grass here is short and sweet. Alpine herbs braid flavor into milk. A windbreak of stones, knee-high, hugs a hollow where last year's dung still bedded the ground. A brown felt cut by tiny tunnels where beetles built their cities. If we knelt here centuries later, we might scoop a pinch and see under a microscope the calcitic spherolites that sheep and goat dung makes when fires burn hot and slow nearby, telling us that people camped and cooked with their animals close. A circle of rocks marks an old hearth. A patch of trampled ground holds the faint outline of a tethering peg. Herding is timekeeping with bodies. Kids and lambs arrive in pulses that align with grass. Milking starts as udders say ready. Weaning sets the longer rhythms of meat and wool or hair. Early herders learn these cycles the hard way, by trying and seeing what the land allows. Too much milk taken early, and kids weaken. Too little, and the household loses a summer's promise of curds. Kill-off profiles leave their stories in bones. A prevalence of young males culled before winter. Older females kept through multiple births. A few old males hinting at breeding roles or human patience. When we later sort mandibles by tooth eruption and wear, long bones by fusion lines, we can reconstruct those decisions. A season, a strategy, a livelihood tuned to slopes. Movements have a social side. Herds draw hands, and hands draw agreements. Who watches which line of animals on bracken-covered traverses where leopards once moved like wind shadows? Who barters milk for grain with a cousin who stayed lower to guard fields? Who walks ahead to mend the small corral before dusk? Dogs lope at the edges, their ears reading terrain as much as sound, their bodies braided into the herd's boundaries like living cord. A simple reed flute rides in a pouch. Its few notes are more than music. A signal at the notch, an answer from below, a reassurance that everyone is where everyone should be. Milk on the high stair is a prompt, not a guarantee. It curdles if left to sun, sours if ash drifts into the pot in the wrong moment. A small camp's toolkit is portable but precise. A jar whose mouth takes a woven lid, a stirrer smoothed by years of circles, a cloth that strains curds and picks up the smell of herbs every summer. Soft cheeses travel down wrapped in leaves. Sour milk eases thirst. Butter carries a meadows library into winter. The taste changes over the ascent and the weeks. Early summer is delicate. By high summer, with herbs thick and animals strong, the fat deepens and scents sharpen. Caprines are not just meat and milk. They are teachers. They show paths to young eyes. They demand fences tighten. They remind households that plots need guarding. Goats test weakness. Sheep amplify panic. A good herder is part animal, part geographer, part meteorologist. Clouds on the ridge at noon read differently than clouds on the same ridge at dusk. A particular gust in the notch means hail 2 minutes hence. The smell that rises from crushed juniper underfoot warns of a slope too dry to linger with sparks. Such knowledge lives in bodies more than in words. It is slow, collective, and hard to see in the archaeological record. But it is the scaffolding of the coexistence we are tracing. What can the ground tell? Corrals leave stains, phosphates soaking soil, dung mats building layers that trap seeds of the plants animals ate and trampled. If a small pen sits near a shelter, a lens of trampled dark earth may hold cuticles of alpine grasses, pollen of subalpine herbs, and charcoal flecks from night fires. Pathways erode into shallow ruts on steep traverses, their bottoms armored with stones pushed by hooves. A summer station's fire spot will contain fat cracked bone splinters mixed with ash in a tighter ratio than a hamlet's big hearth. If a pot breaks here, its sherds speak of rougher tempers and repairs. Staple holes along a crack, resin seals. A vessel asked to move often and endure jolts. Consensus is strong that seasonal vertical movements, short and medium-range circuits binding low plots to high meadows, were common across the Caucasus by the 6th millennium BCE, with roots stretching earlier in some valleys. Sheep and goats dominate the domestic animal bones in many assemblages. Cattle are rarer in the highest stations, more common lower where traction and manure matter. Minority views argue for zones where herding was late and fragile, with wild game remaining the main meat for longer. They remind us to avoid drawing uniform timetables from a few well-studied basins. We will keep those cautions close. Myth versus evidence, brief prelude. It's tempting to imagine pastoralism arriving fully formed, herds sweeping in, tethering people to new identities overnight. Evidence points elsewhere. Herding thickens slowly, grafted onto forager knowledge of slope, weather, and water. It learned as it moved. When we later meet kill-off curves and dung spherulites, we will read practice, not proclamation. A day on the stair ends with care. Animals brought into a small pen. A hearth lit inside a windbreak. A pot warmed to blood temperature under a practiced hand. The boy with the sling walks the perimeter and drops a stone in each corner as if he were stitching the evening to the ground. Stars arrive one by one. The bells go quiet. A dog sighs. In that quiet, decisions take shape for morning, up another 100 meters to a fresher tongue of grass, or down to the hamlet, because clouds built over the western shoulder with a shape that means sleet. Ethical note: when we read this pass through bones and soils, we often need to sample intensely to separate sheep from goat, domestic from wild, season from season. Teeth drilled for enamel chemistry, thin sections cut from dung mats, collagen lifted for age and diet. Each removes material that cannot be replaced. The return must be clear. Questions with real power to illuminate lifeways, shared results, and partnerships with the people whose mountains and memories hold these stations. Uncertainty box. How high did herds range in different centuries? And did roots shift with mid-Holocene climate wiggles? Oxygen isotopes in enamel can hint at altitude of water sources during tooth growth. But Local microclimates complicate signals. Can we distinguish pen dung from open grazing deposits with confidence across varied soils? Spherulites help, but fire histories and pH matter. How early, how widespread was systematic dairying versus opportunistic milk use? Lipids in pots whisper, not shout, and mixing with meat stews blurs their voices. We will answer what we can, with dates pulled taut against the ground plans. For now, let the stare remain in your ear, the bell, the low note of a dog, the close, companionable clack of horn on horn as animals settle. This is one strand of the mosaic, and it explains why fields did not erase nets, why milk did not silence rivers. The corridor holds both because people did, day after day, with feet that learned two sets of paths. In the next part, we'll set aside the meadow for a table of numbers, methods and evidence and build a careful timeline with radiocarbon dates tied together by Bayesian models that honor both context and uncertainty. Tonight we lay out the measuring sticks, how we turn charcoal flecks, seeds, bones, and soot-dark floors into a timeline that runs calmly from 7,000 to 4,500 BCE without pretending more precision than the Earth will allow. This is the quiet architecture beneath our story. Radiocarbon dating, careful sample choice, and Bayesian models that braid single facts into sequences that respect the ground. Begin with the material itself. Radiocarbon works best when we date things that lived briefly and died once. In lowland hamlets and piedmont fans, that often means carbonized cereal grains, barley or einkorn kernels that a hearth reddened, then forgot. Nutshell fragments do good work too, they're carbon trapped by fire. Farther upslope, short-lived twigs from hearth charcoal are better than hefty heartwood. The old wood problem, where wood lived long before burning, can make a fire look centuries older than the meal it warmed. Bone offers dates too, through collagen, the protein fraction protected within the mineral. Human and animal bones from hearth rakeouts, pits, or quiet burials each carry time, though not all preserve equally, especially where water moves and soils breathe too much oxygen. A first safeguard is pre-treatment. In the lab, a grain or nutshell is cleaned of humic acids that creep through soils. Bone is inspected for collagen yield and elemental ratios, carbon to nitrogen within a narrow comfort band, that tell us the protein is real, not a ghost rebuilt by groundwater. Samples that fail these tests do not travel forward. That refusal is not loss. It is honesty that keeps the timeline from wandering. Calibrating radiocarbon is where carbon-14 counts turn into calendar years. We compare measured activity to reference curves built from tree rings and other archives, IntCal for the Northern Hemisphere. The early Middle Holocene is not a straight road. It has wiggles and plateaus. Around the 6th millennium BCE, the curve flattens in places. A flat curve means a single radiocarbon age may map to a spread of calendar possibilities. We do not fight these plateaus with false certainty. We bring in context and modeling to narrow them honestly. Context begins in the trench. A seed from a floor cut by a post hole sits after the post setting, not before. A charred lens under a packed hearth belongs to a use episode earlier than the surface above it. We record these relations as if they were grammar, earlier than, later than, contemporary within a phase. Stratigraphy, negative features, pits, post holes, and interfaces, trampled floors, become the scaffolding for a model. Bayesian modeling, implemented in tools like OxCal or BCal, lets us express that scaffolding with care. Imagine a hamlet as a sequence with boundaries for its beginning and end. Within it, phases gather dates that belong to smeared activities: early occupation, hearth rebuilding, storage pit use. We enter each radiocarbon determination with its laboratory error and ask the model to calculate posterior distributions that honor both the physics of decay and the field relations. Outlier models help guard the gate. A twig of old wood can be downweighted if it refuses to agree with the rest. A suspiciously recent shell, contaminated by modern carbon, can be gently shown the door. Agreement indices, numbers the model produces to tell us how well dates and structure fit, are not magic grades, but they help us see when we've asked the impossible. If a phase composed of grain dates straddles a boundary in ways our trowels say it cannot, the model will complain. We listen, revisit context, and edit hypotheses before we edit the past. Some cases invite wiggle matching. If we are lucky enough to recover a short run of consecutive tree rings from a post, Not common in these early hamlets, but possible in riparian woods. We can align their internal spacing of radiocarbon ages to the calibration curve and anchor a short span with unusual precision. More often, we accept the grain of the record. A hearth's 3 charred kernels cluster within a century. A rebuilding episode and its post pits form a pulse that likely lasted 1 or 2 human generations. Now widen the view. Our corridor holds many small sites rather than a few giant ones. Each contributes a handful of good dates. Alone, they are modest. Together, ordered by rivers and passes, they become a staircase we can climb. We build regional models that treat each valley as a sequence. First appearance of pottery in small numbers, first solid presence of domestic caprines, earliest reliable serial signal in macro remains. We allow overlaps because the gradient is real. Goats reach a high meadow while, 2 rivers over, nets are still doing heavy lifting at weirs. We do not force synchrony where the land resists it. 2 cautions come with bone. First, diet can bend a date if a person or animal ate too much fish from rivers that incorporate old carbon from limestone or long residence pools, the freshwater reservoir effect. Humans along rich rivers may look older in radiocarbon than their true calendar age. We can test this by pairing samples, a fish bone and a cereal grain from the same hearth, a human bone and a sheep bone from the same pit. If offsets appear, we correct with a local reservoir estimate and mark the uncertainty. Second, small domestic dogs share meals with people and can mirror their reservoir quirks. We treat dog bones as companions in both senses. Lovely for diet reconstruction, used with caution for dating. What about dung and floors? Dung burned as fuel produces ash rich in phosphates and spherolites, but poor in datable carbon. Floors packed and repacked become palimpsests. We date their events by dating the things locked into them. Seeds trampled at a particular resurfacing, twigs in the ash of a specific repair. Bayesian phases allow this. Activities smeared a little in time, but meaningfully grouped. We also use cross-checks beyond radiocarbon. Pottery typology is a blunt tool at this age, but rim forms and paste recipes change, slowly enough to be helpful when a valley's sequence is known. Obsidian hydration is too climate-sensitive to anchor absolute dates here, but it sometimes ranks relative breaks within a site. Dendrochronology rarely stretches back far enough in this region for the 7th millennium. Yet where subfossil wood survives in wetlands, it can bracket events tightly. Let us build a small example in words. In a Piedmont hamlet, we have 3 charred barley grains from a hearth lens, a burnt twig from the same lens, a short-lived nutshell from a storage pit cut into a floor that overlies the hearth, and a goat metacarpal with good collagen from a dump above both. Field notes say, hearth use, phase A, resurfacing and pit cut, phase B, later, dump, phase C, later still. We model a sequence with boundaries around the hamlet's life, then phase A, grain, twig, then phase B, nutshell, then phase C, goat bone. The model returns calendar ranges. Phase A peaking, 5600 500 BCE, Phase B 5450 5400 BCE, Phase C 5400 5350 BCE, each with credible intervals that cross decades. The agreement is high. The twig is slightly older than the grains, but not wildly so. The goat bone overlaps the shell's late tail, which we expect. We do not celebrate exact years. We exhale at the coherence of lifeways. Grain hearth first, resurfacing, and storage next, caprine heavy dump last. Multiply this logic across valleys and ridges, and a regional timeline emerges. Uneven, but navigable. Ethical note: all of this rests on destructive sampling. A grain turned to CO2 in a graphitization line is gone forever. A drilled rib will never be whole again. We work under permits, with community consent, and we publish open data so that each lost milligram yields the widest possible return. We also privilege short-lived samples and duplicates where possible, so that a single sherd or bone does not carry more weight than it can bear. Uncertainty box. Are we seeing the earliest arrival of pottery and domesticates, or just the earliest we have found? Discovery is not occurrence. Survey coverage in high valleys is uneven. Floodplains erase as much as they preserve. Calibration plateaus widen credible intervals in precisely the centuries we care about. Freshwater reservoir effects vary from stream to stream and season to season. Corrections are local, not one size fits all. Bayesian models are only as honest as their priors. If we misread a pit's relation to a floor, the math will obediently make a neat error. Our answer is redundancy: multiple materials, paired samples, explicit stratigraphic logic, and transparent reporting. Set the ruler down. The numbers are not the story, but they are the rails that keep it from drifting. With dates tied to floors and fire spots, we can now ask finer questions. When do pots begin to carry the ghosts of milk and meat? How do meals change through time? When does herding thicken from occasional to expected? In the next part, we'll step from timelines into textures, lipids in clay, pots that remember meals, and let absorbed fats whisper what simmered on the fire. Hold assured to your cheek. It is cool, faintly gritty, and, if you could shrink your eyes to the size of a molecule, full of corridors. Early pottery here is often low-fired and porous. Fats slip into those pores when meals simmer, some are trapped by cooling, some bind to mineral surfaces, and a few survive for millennia, altered but legible. Tonight we listen to those quiet ghosts, how we coax them out, how we tell one creature's fat from another's, and what that means for mixed tables along the Caucasus corridor. Start with choosing where to sample. We avoid decorated edges and visible sooting that might carry modern oils. We cut a small, clean wedge from a broken interior, one that was in contact with the food, not the fire. If a use crust clings to the surface, a black, friable layer, we note it, but we do not trust it by itself. Crusts can be palimpsests of many meals and easy targets for modern contamination. The prize lies within the wall. In the lab, the shirt is ground to a fine powder and soaked in solvents. A common sequence uses methanol and dichloromethane to pull out lipids. The extract is then methanolized to convert fatty acids into methyl esters, the forms our machines can read. Gas chromatography mass spectrometry, GCMS, separates and identifies compounds by how they travel and break in a hot, thin column. Palmitic acid, C16-duro, stearic acid, C18-duro, longer waxy chains if beeswax once sealed the lid, plant markers if leafy matter simmered. In some cases we go further. Gas chromatography, combustion isotope ratio mass spectrometry, GCC-IRMS, measures the carbon isotope values of individual fatty acids, not the whole stew at once. That step is where a whisper becomes a sentence. Why the isotopes? Because ruminant dairy, ruminant adipose, body fat, and non-ruminant fats tend to fall in different places when we look at the difference between the D13C of C18-duro and C16-duro, often written as D13C, C18-no, C16-no. In temperate regions dominated by C3 plants, as here, dairy fats from sheep or goats usually show a more negative D13C than ruminant body fat. The reason lives in how microbes in a ruminant's multi-chambered stomach process carbon before it flows into milk. We do not lean on any single threshold as a cliff. We look at ranges, at reference fats rendered from modern analogs, and at whether multiple sherds from one context tell the same story. Aquatic signals have their own fingerprints. When fish oils rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids are heated for hours, some of those chains cyclize and rearrange into compounds with long names but distinctive shapes. O-alkyl phenyl, alkanoic acids, often shortened to APAAs. Their presence is a strong hint of cooked aquatic resources. Other helpers include certain isoprenoid fatty acids from plankton sources, though these vary by water body. Plant processing leaves subtler traces. Long-chain N-alkanes and N-alcohols from cuticular waxes, sometimes odd over even chain length patterns. And, if luck is kind, residues of leafy greens or seeds whose chemistry survived gentle boiling. Now imagine 3 sherds from our corridor. The first is from a Piedmont hamlet's squat cooking jar, its exterior lightly sooted, its rim simple. GCMS shows abundant C16-0 and C18 with traces of longer chains consistent with animal fat. GCC-IRMS places the D13C in the cluster typical for ruminant adipose, not dairy. That pot likely saw meat stews, goat or sheep, perhaps with a little bone to enrich the broth. The second sherd is from an upland summer station, a small vessel, repaired twice with resin, clearly well loved. Its D13C falls in the dairy range, and we find a faint suite of short-chain triacyl glycerols that often accompany milk processing. The third, from a riverside camp, tells a mixed tale. APAAs present, pointing to heated fish oils. Animal fatty acids too, with a D13C that leans toward adipose, and a scatter of plant wax signals. That pot may have seen fish stews with added fat, or a sequence of meals, fish one week, meat the next, over months that the clay remembers as a blur. Beeswax appears now and then, and when it does, it is eloquent. A bouquet of long-chain N-alkanes, C27, C29, C31, long-chain N-alcohols, and palmitate wax esters. Beeswax in a cooking pot can mean several things: lid sealing, vessel waterproofing, or sweetening. In the Caucasus, where hollow trees and cliff cavities offer wild hives, honey collection is plausible early, yet we stay cautious. Wax can migrate from a sealed lid to a rim, and later reuse can add new voices to old walls. Not every sherd speaks clearly. Heat and microbes alter fats. Palmitic acid often survives better than stearic, skewing ratios. Soil bacteria can add their own lipids. We use procedural blanks and soil controls to see who is singing off stage. Some pastes take up lipids readily, and then, over thousands of wet-dry cycles, let them move within the wall. We therefore sample at multiple depths across the cross-section when possible, looking for profiles that peak at the interior and fall toward the exterior, signs of absorption from food rather than contamination from the ground. Mixing is both a culinary reality and an analytical headache. Meat plus milk in the same pot can pull D13C toward the middle. Plant oils added to stretch a stew blur ruminant signals. To handle this, we do not read any one number as a verdict. We combine compound-specific isotope data with the broader GCMS pattern, with context, upland summer station versus winter hamlet, with other finds, dung spherulites nearby, fish bones in the same hearth rakeout. When multiple lines converge, we let the interpretation solidify. When they do not, we leave the answer soft. Regional patterning emerges as the dataset grows. In many South Caucasus basins, early pottery returns a mix. Adipose-rich stews common in lowland hamlets, clearer dairy signals more frequent in upland stations and on sites that otherwise tell herding stories. Aquatic markers along major rivers and lake margins. None of this excludes grain. Flour leaves fewer lipid traces, but we see its shadow in the company it keeps. Burned kernels in the same feature, starch granules trapped in stone tool gloss, phytoliths in pit fills. The pot is a chorus member, not a soloist. Ethical note: absorbed residue analysis is destructive. Each sherd we powder is a unique voice we quiet to hear better. We work with small subsamples, document breaks, prioritize already broken pieces, and return all data to open repositories so future questions can stand on present sacrifice. Where communities wish to retain vessels intact, we respect that decision and turn to non-destructive options. External swabs, or micro-sampling that does not alter a fragment's silhouette, even if that means the chemistry sings more quietly. Uncertainty box. Dairy thresholds shift with herd diet. If goats graze more shrubs or drought-stressed herbs, isotopic baselines move. Modern reference fats must be locally grounded. IPAs require significant heating time to form. Brief poaching of fish may leave little trace. Some river systems carry algae that muddy aquatic biomarkers. Not all lakes are equal. Beeswax can migrate and mimic cooking signals. Finally, pots travel. A vessel made in a lowland paste might be used at altitude. Paste mineralogy affects lipid preservation. We answer with context-rich sampling, many sherds from single features, paired animal bones and charred grains for dates, modern reference fats from nearby herds eating known diets. Stand up from the bench and return the sherd to its tray. Its silence now feels fuller, full of meals that were neither purely wild nor purely domestic, but layered, seasonal, and practical. The chemistry does not tell us names or recipes, it tells us habits. In the corridor, habits are the point. In the next part, we'll step from pots to people, strontium footprints, who grew up where, and see how tooth enamel carries childhood landscapes, from low fields to high meadows and back again. Hold a tooth to the light, and you're holding a small, precise map of childhood. Not a map with lines and names, but a chemical geography built from the rocks a child's food and water once flowed across. Strontium, an element that follows calcium into bones and teeth, makes this map readable. Its isotopes, especially the ratio of 87 SR to 86 SR, echo the bedrock beneath our steps. Old granites, radiogenic and time-rich, push that ratio higher. Young volcanic flows, quick-cooled and fresh, sit lower. Limestones often cluster in the middle, tuned by ancient seas. Plants drink what soils give, animals eat the plants. Enamel locks the signal in a crystalline vault that time barely touches. If we choose carefully, sigh carefully and read gently, enamel can tell us where a person grew up, or at least where their early meals came from. Begin with why enamel helps more than bone. Bone remodels. It is a restless ledger, rewritten year by year, vulnerable to groundwater's edits after burial. Enamel does not remodel. Once formed, it is a sealed letter. First molars, M1, begin their story in the first year of life and finish by about age 3. Second molars, M2, record mid-childhood. Third molars, M3, for those who grow them, speak of adolescence. Deciduous teeth whisper of even earlier months. By sampling different teeth from the same individual, we can hear movements across childhood. A family that wintered low and summered high, or that shifted valleys altogether when alliances or harvests changed. The corridor matters here. The Caucasus is a tight mosaic of geologies, volcanic plateaus in the south and east, limestones and marls in folded belts, crystalline rocks peeking through in places, river flats dressed in alluvium reworked from many sources. Add dust blown seasonally from distant basins, and you have a mixed pantry of strontium for plants and grazing animals. To use teeth as maps, we first need a baseline, what counts as local in each valley. We do not guess. We collect plants, small mammals with small home ranges, mice, voles, and snails whose shells fix local signals. We sample stream waters in different seasons and pastures at different heights. Those values sketch the bioavailable strontium, what food chains actually use, rather than just the bedrock's theoretic number. Picture a Piedmont hamlet we visited earlier. Its baseline clusters around a mid-range 87 SAR 86er, fed by limestones and marls weathered into deep soils. A summer meadow 2 days walk upslope sits on young volcanics, lower in ratio. A river terrace downstream, where the channel reworks a patchwork of sources, gives a moderate spread. When we measure a child's M1 from the hamlet burial ground and find a value in the Piedmont cluster, we do not shout local, as if drawing a border. We say, more carefully, that early life is consistent with the hamlet's belt and with other places that share its geology. If an M2 then shifts lower, toward the volcanic plateaus, we have a hint. Summers spent higher, milk, and greens drawn from rocks younger than those beneath the hamlet's floor. Laser ablation lets us resolve the story even finer. Rather than drilling one bulk sample from a tooth, we can run a thin path along enamel growth lines and watch the ratio change across months. A wave-like pattern, higher, then lower, then higher, may mark a family's seasonal swing. Lowland winters, moderate ratios, upland summers, low, and back again. A flat line across a childhood band implies stability. One valley, one water, one field. Both patterns are honest, neither is better. They tell us what the corridor allowed and what a household chose. Add caprines to the reading, because herds carry strontium too. A goat's molar formed in its first years records the pasture's geology, not the hamlet's. When we pair human and goat enamel from the same site, we can test the idea of shared circuits. If people's children show the same seasonal swing as goats, both bending toward the volcanic signal each summer, we glimpse a household that climbed together. If goats swing but children do not, we imagine a split. Some stayed low to guard grain and weirs, while others took herds up. Neither scenario contradicts a mosaic. Both compose it. Consensus among researchers is steady on the broad method. Enamel 87 SAR 86 SAR is a robust tracer of childhood landscapes when anchored to local baselines. And the Caucasus, with its short distances between different rocks, makes the tracer especially informative. Views diverge, reasonably, over how mobile communities were and whether seasonal movements were household-wide or task-specific. Some projects find many individuals whose childhoods fit a narrow local band, suggesting stability with only short-range excursions. Others reveal substantial outliers, persons buried in one valley whose enamel points to a childhood beyond the next ridge system or even across a major basin. We will flag outliers when they appear and resist turning a few travelers into a marching migration. Complications are real and worth naming. Diagenesis, post-burial alteration, can creep into enamel through cracks or along dentine interfaces. We screen with microscopy, look for correlated rare earth elements that signal groundwater intrusion, and compare enamel to dentine and to bone. If enamel holds steady while bone wanders, we trust enamel. Dust can push bioavailable strontium away from bedrock expectations, important where winds carry far-traveled sediments. Pastures manured for decades can adopt the herd's signature, blurring the line between local rock and local practice. And food is not only local. A child can drink milk from goats pastured high while living low, or eat plants traded from a neighbor's plot on different geology. The enamel will average what the stomach met. Ethical note: mapping movement touches identity. When human teeth are involved, we ask permissions, explain limits clearly, and return results in accessible language. A strontium ratio is not a passport, it is a probability. We share data with local scholars and communities. When remains are few, revered, or protected, we do not sample. Curiosity does not outrank care. Uncertainty kicks. How fine is fine in a place like this? Two valleys separated by a pass can host similar 87 SAR, 86 SAR if their soils mix sources in the same way. Enamel cannot tell them apart cleanly. Seasonal dust pulses can seasonally shift local, especially on open plateaus. Infant enamel can reflect the mother's diet as much as the infant's local water. Breastfeeding imprints a family's choices. Laser transects increase resolution, but also exposure to microcracks and diagenesis. We weigh gain against risk. Finally, baselines are living things. Streams change course, terraces rework sediments. Maps must be updated, not assumed. Still, when we stack careful baselines beside careful enamel, patterns emerge. In lowland hamlets with strong herding signatures, many children's M1s cluster in piedmont ranges, while later teeth lean toward upland values, movement thickening through early childhood as households commit to summer circuits. In river-marginal communities with strong fishing signatures, enamel often stays within narrow, mixed alluvium bands, movement more lateral than vertical, with trips along water rather than up. At crossroads near passes, outliers increase. Childhoods from other basins appear in burial grounds, hinting at marriages, foster age, or new families settling in from a valley or two away. None of this looks like clean replacement. It looks like threads woven and rewoven until a cloth becomes strong. Strontium footprints do not tell us what people ate, only where their food likely grew. To hear water and diet themselves, we need other isotopes that move with breath and meal, not just rock. Oxygen in enamel and carbon in collagen will help with that. Oxygen tracing the water we drink, and the altitude or climate it remembers. Carbon sketching plant baselines and the mix of field and flock. Woven with strontium's map, they turn location into lifeway. For now, tuck the tooth back into its labeled bag. It is said enough for one evening that childhoods here were often local, with a seasonal sway, that some children's earliest years began across a ridge and settled later, that the corridor's gift is choice, exercised patiently across generations. In the next part, we'll follow those choices into the air and onto the table. Oxygen and carbon, water, altitude, and diet. And let breath and bone add climate and meal to the map. Breathe in. The air you draw, the water you drink, and the food you chew all leave faint signatures that bodies quietly file away. Oxygen and carbon isotopes are two such signatures, subtle, not slogans. Read with care, they add weather and meal to the landscape map we traced with strontium. Begin with oxygen in tooth enamel. When rain forms, it sorts oxygen's isotopes, 18O and 16O, according to temperature, moisture source, and altitude. As clouds climb mountains, they rain out the heavier 18O first. Higher places drink lighter water. Seasonal changes matter too. Summer rain is usually heavier than winter snowmelt. Animals drink these waters, fold them into body fluids, and, during enamel formation, lock a version of that signal into mineral. We usually measure oxygen in enamel phosphate, D18OP, or carbonate, D18OC. Both are useful if we mine their quirks. Phosphate is more resistant to alteration. Carbonate can be more sensitive to environmental swings, but also to diagenesis. So, we screen, compare, and cross-check with strontium and microscopic integrity before we trust a number. In the Caucasus corridor, vertical distance is short, but climatic gradients are steep. A child raised in a piedmont hamlet that relies on stream water, mixed from snow and rain, will tend toward lower D18O than a child whose family winters low but summers high. drinking from springs fed by recent snowmelt at altitude, still lower, often, but modulated by warm day evaporation in troughs and skins. Add seasonality. If enamel growth spans both winter and summer, the signal averages these oscillations. If it spans a narrow window, we can catch a seasonal slice. Laser ablation transects along growth lines. Let us watch D18O swing with the year, like a gentle sine wave. Low, Bayous as snowmelt dominates. Higher as summer rains and evaporation shade the water the household used. Now, turn to carbon. Here, we listen to two related choirs. Carbon in bone collagen, D13C shish call, summarizes the protein portion of diet over the last years of life. Carbon in enamel carbonate, D13C carb, registers the whole diet, protein, carbohydrates, and fats, during tooth formation. The baseline matters. In the early Middle Holocene Caucasus, plants are overwhelmingly C3, tempered in trees and cereals such as einkorn and barley. C4 crops like millet, which carry much higher D13C, are not part of the local pantry in our window. Their broader uptake is later. That simplifies interpretation. Within a C3 world, D13C shifts mainly with canopy effects. Deep forest foods look slightly lighter. With water stress, arid edge plants can look heavier, and with aquatic food chains, which can be variable. We listen for relative differences across people and places, rather than chasing absolute thresholds. Put oxygen and carbon together and patterns emerge. In a river marginal community with strong fishing and wetland gathering, adult bone collagen might show slightly elevated D15N. We will keep nitrogen modestly in the background today, but it helps. And D13C call values consistent with C3-based protein, meat, fish, and modest cereal protein. Children's enamel D18O may be relatively stable if households drank from the same lowland channels year-round. Up in transhumance circuits, we expect broader D18O swings, summer snowmelt, winter lowland waters, and enamel D13C carb that nudges towards slightly higher values if open herb pastures and drier air dominate intake during enamel growth months. Paired with strontium, this lets us say not just where, but what kind of water and plant context frame childhood. Milk threads through carbon's story. Dairying, when systematic, can tilt D13C and D15N in ways that echo through collagen. Milk and meat from animals feeding on subalpine herbs carry the plant's carbon signature. If dairy replaces some fish or wild meat in children's weaning foods, we may see the 15N rise during breastfeeding, maternal protein routed through milk stacks at trophic level, then fall with weaning as cereal porridges and diluted dairy take over. In enamel, this can surface as D13C carb values that track weaning age when read across a population. Earlier weaning, slightly lighter enamel carbonate as plant carbohydrates enter sooner. Later weaning, slightly heavier early segments from milk-rich diets, especially if herds grazed sunny, water-stressed meadows. These are small shifts, population-level patterns, not hard stamps on any one child. Collagen's carbon adds adult perspective. Across hamlets where hunting and mast remain central, D13C call tends to hover in the typical C3 range, with modest variation. Where cereal contributions to protein grow, through gruels, breads with legume admixtures, or simply more plant protein overall, D13C call may drift a touch lighter, more negative, at the same time that wear on molars and starch polish on tools increase. In communities emphasizing dairy and meat from upland grazers, D13C call can edge heavier, mirroring pasture openness and water stress. We verify these directional hints with residues in pots, with animal collagen from the same texts, and with stable nitrogen to guard against fish confusions. Water choices complicate oxygen. Skins left in the sun enrich D18O in stored water. Boiling in open pots does the same. Ice melt drunk quickly can depress D18O below stream averages. A family that prefers spring water over river water will chart differently than a neighbor who favors rain-filled cisterns. That is why we sample many individuals in many contexts. We are mapping practice, not finding a single local value. Let's imagine a small data set from one Piedmont valley. Children's M1 enamel D18OP clusters tightly. Their D13C carb is consistent with C3 diets, with a slight spread that could reflect season of formation and household differences in milk versus grain pap during weaning. Their M2 enamel shows broader D18O swings and a slight D13C carb shift upward, consistent with first summers spent higher, drinking lighter waters and eating more animal-derived calories as chores expand. Adults' bone collagen D13C call averages slightly heavier than the C3 forest baselines, with a tail of lower values among individuals buried nearer dense canopy zones downstream. None of this proves a clean break from foraging. Rather, it breathes life into the gradient. The same valley hosts families weighting their menus differently, in rhythms keyed to altitude and season. Now, place a riverside settlement into the comparison. Here, children's D18op range is narrow, water sources more constant, drawn from the main channel and backwaters. Enamel D13C carb stays firmly C3 but is a hair lighter on average than in the upland-facing hamlet, consistent with more plant carbohydrate during weaning and fewer milk-rich months. Adult D13C call overlaps the Piedmont values, but includes individuals with slightly lower D13C and higher D15N, candidates for fish-heavy protein, though we tread carefully because freshwater systems can vary wildly. When we can, we pair human collagen with fish and herbivore collagen from the same features to ground the local isotopic ecology before we tell diet stories. Ethical note: reading oxygen and carbon means drilling enamel and digesting collagen, irreversible steps. We do it sparingly, with permits and partnership, favoring teeth and bones that are already fragmented and selecting the smallest possible samples consistent with good measurement. We share raw data so that communities and other researchers can revisit interpretations as baselines improve. Uncertainty box. Enamel diagenesis can nudge D18O carb. We mitigate by preferring phosphate measurements and using screening, infrared spectroscopy, carbonate to phosphate ratios. Breastfeeding and weaning overlay environmental signals. Infant enamel reflects maternal intake as much as local water. Microclimate matters, south-facing slopes, shady gullies, and storage practices all perturb oxygen. Carbon in collagen tracks protein, not entire diet. Plant-heavy calories can hide behind protein from milk and meat. The C3 simplicity helps, but canopy effects and aridity can mimic small dietary changes. Solutions: sample widely, pair human and faunal isotopes. Combine with residues, tools, and zoo archaeology, and treat single outliers as questions, not answers. Step back to the corridor. Oxygen tells us how water moved through lives, up and down slopes, through seasons, from spring to skin to sip. Carbon sketches how meals leaned, trees shade or meadows glare, grains patience or milk's immediacy. Together with strontium's geology and pot lipids recipes, they paint a mosaic that does not need replacement to look like change. It needs time, experiment, and families that keep multiple options open. In the next part, we'll pause for myth versus evidence why farmers replaced foragers, and measure that clean story against the mixed, season-tuned realities the land and the molecules have been whispering. The clean story is tempting because it is easy to picture. Fields spread like a green quilt, herds arrive behind them, and the people who once set nets in backwaters and walked mast-rich groves fold their skills like old maps and slip away. In the morning, foragers. By nightfall, farmers. That is the myth. It has rhythm, a sense of progress, and the comfort of a single arrow. Now, hold that arrow against the corridor you have been walking. Ridges and passes, short distances between very different belts of land, rivers that offer fish when fields drown, meadows that offer milk when mast fails. In such a place, clean replacement runs uphill against the grain. The evidence, quiet, cumulative, sign-specific, asks us to trade the arrow for a braid. Begin with time. Radiocarbon sequences anchored to floors, pits, and hearths show long overlaps, not neat handoffs. Pottery, domestic caprines, and charred cereals do appear in the 6th millennium BCE across several valleys. But microliths, net sinkers, and barbed points do not vanish on cue. Bayesian models that respect site stratigraphy spread habits across decades to centuries. Stews with ruminant adipose simmer alongside pots that later carry dairy signals. Fish bones persist through phases that also yield grinding stones worn into shallow saddles. Replacement would compress these into sharp, staged events. The corridor keeps them overlapping like seasons. Listen to meals as clay remembers them. Lipid residues return mixed kitchens, adipose-rich stews in lowland hamlets, dairy signatures at upland summer stations, aquatic markers along riverine camps. Crucially, these are not stratified into before and after blocks. They co-occur within single sites and, sometimes, single features. A hearth rakeout yields charred barley kernels, fish vertebrae, and a sherd whose 13C sits squarely in the ruminant range. That is not a camp abandoning one lifeway for another. It is a household widening its repertoire. Bodies echo the same song. Strontium in children's enamel outlines childhoods that are local but sway seasonally. Flat in river marginal settlements, wavy in hamlets that summer high. Oxygen catches water choices in altitude. Carbon senses open meadows and forest edges. The patterns are plural. Some families hold to narrow bands, others pendulum between belts. Uniform population movements, the kind implied by clean replacement, would flatten these spreads. Instead, we see a corridor thick with options taken differently by households that share fences, hearths, and news. Toolkits resist a tidy line, too. Sickles inset with lustrous microliths cut grain in the same assemblages as finely retouched points suited to fish and birds. Groundstones and mortars proliferate, yes, but so do weights for nets and traces of traps. Edge polish on blades alternates between glossy cereal sheen and duller signatures from meat and hides. If you could empty a single household's tool basket at summer's end, it would look like the land, part field, part river, part meadow. Animals tell time with their bones. Kill-off curves for caprines at many sites show classic herd management, young males culled, older females retained. Yet red deer, wild boar, and hare do not fall to zero. Dung spherulites at summer stations sit beside small piles of charred nutshell and the occasional fish spine. In winter hamlets, goat dung floors and fish weirs can be neighbors. Where replacement is real, wild taxa plummet decisively. Here, they taper unevenly, holding ground in zones where rivers or mast pay better than fields. Architecture adds a quiet note. Early houses are round or oval, light on their foundations, and easy to repair. Some shelters dip into the earth for insulation. Pens are small. Nothing about this fabric shouts closure of choices. As plots lengthen and fields stabilize, walls thicken and plans straighten, but even then, the ground keeps pockets that look like pauses, the shelter by a fast stream, the temporary windbreak on a summer shelf. Built environment here is not a manifesto. It's a field notebook, adaptive, provisional, and revised annually. What about people themselves? Did new populations sweep in and replace old ones? Ancient DNA will have its own part later, but the short answer from the broader region is that gene flow and cultural flow rarely move as a single block. Where genomes are available in the Caucasus and adjacent zones for this window, they tend to show admixture and persistence. Threads of ancestry that predate farming braided with strands that traveled with domesticates and ideas. That is consistent with a mosaic. People learn from neighbors, marry across passes, adopt pots and plots while keeping nets and slings, and raise children whose enamel reads both river and ridge. There are, of course, sharper turns in the weave. In some basins, the first strong pulse of pottery and domesticates is followed, within a generation or two, by denser hamlets and a drop in wild taxa. A few sequences look more abrupt than their neighbors. These places are important. They remind us that mosaic is not code for stasis. It is speed control tuned to local geography. A valley with wide, renewably silted fans and few high meadows may lean faster toward fields. A corridor with steep walls and generous pastures may keep herding and foraging central, while cereals ride as insurance. Replacement, where it happens, is patchy in space and lumpy in time. Myth thrives on invisibility, the things that taphonomy hides. Floodplains erase earlier camps, later plows smear shallow floors. Caves overrepresent tasks that suit caves. If our discoveries were existence itself, the clean story might feel closer. But discovery is not occurrence. That is why methods matter. Paired dates on grains and bones, compound-specific lipids, enamel transects, faunal baselines. When we stack them, the mosaic holds. A brief, respectful correction to an older scholarly habit. The word Neolithic can be a strong magnet, pulling diverse practices into a single frame the moment pottery or domesticated bones appear. In the Caucasus corridor, Neolithic is better read as a package under negotiation. its pieces adopted at different rates in different belts by people with excellent reasons. Naming the package should not erase the negotiations. Ethical note: challenging the replacement myth is not just a technical exercise. It touches living identities attached to mountains and rivers. When we present mosaics rather than arrows, we are closer to how ancestors likely understood their lives. We also avoid implying that communities lagged because they kept nets in use while sowing small plots. Respect begins with not grading the past on someone else's curve. Uncertainty box: could our mixed signals come from sequential use, fish in spring, meat in autumn, rather than simultaneous diversity? Yes, and that is precisely the point. Seasonal switching is coexistence in time. Could enamel signals be averaging milk traded from high pastures rather than families moving? In some cases, yes. That is why we pair human teeth with goat teeth and local baselines. Might abrupt shifts be hidden in valleys we have barely surveyed? Certainly. The answer is continued: thoughtful field work beyond well-trodden basins, and the humility to leave some arrows undrawn. Set the myth down gently. In its place, hold a slower picture: families carrying multiple skills, choosing among them as ridges, rivers, and years suggest. A gradient of practice sliding from lowland plots to upland pastures and back, with weirs and groves filling the gaps. The corridor does not need replacement to change. It needs patience, memory, and a willingness to keep two trails open at once. In the next part, we'll open the tool baskets, toolkits in tandem, microliths to sickles, and let edges, gloss, and grindstones show how hands match tasks to season without surrendering older crafts. Lay a blanket in the shade and empty a year's work onto it. You'll see a kit that refuses to choose a single future. In one corner, slender blades struck from obsidian cores, some retouched into trapezes and crescents. Microliths that love shafts and slots and turn light wood into reliable edges. Beside them, a wooden sickle spine inset with those same blades, its teeth deepened to a dark honey by sickle gloss, the polish that silica-rich cereal stalks lay down like varnish over a harvest. Nearby, groundstones, handstones worn to a gentle saddle, mortars with lips rounded by thousands of circles, hammerstones salted with bright scars. Add bone and antler points, a tangle of cordage, a net weight smoothed by thumbs, a perforated shell, a wedge that split firewood, and a clay jar lid with a beeswax line. It's not one kit, it's a calendar. Let's move through the pieces the way a year moves. Spring wakes the water. Nets and weirs come first, and the tools that support them are deceptively quiet. A bone gauge for knot spacing, a pile of rounded weights carved from river cobbles, a flake with a bevel, brightened not by grain but by cordage. Twisted plant fibers leave a soft, fibrous polish under magnification. Micro-wear analysts read these surfaces like grammar: transverse polish with fine striations for meat and hide, longitudinal, slick bands for silica-rich plants, a matte, pitted gleam for wood. Net mending adds its own signature to the retouched edges. Tiny edge rounding, feather-light polish that collects near the tip. In camps by backwaters, micro-debitage, the glitter of tiny waste flakes, settles around hearths and along mats where hands worked while smoke drifted. A few barb points lie to one side, their barbs regular and the tangs worn smooth. Some are bone, some antler, a few stone. They confirm what the lipids and bones already suggested: fish on the table, and often. Early summer draws bodies uphill. The kit lightens, but it doesn't shrink. In the pouch, an obsidian core no bigger than a fist, a pressure flaker made from antler tine, a handful of microlith blanks waiting for a minute's sharpening. Obsidian loves pressure. A prepared platform, a steady hand, and long, narrow blades jump with a crisp snap that feels in the fingers like cracking dry ice. Sourcing those glossy blacks matters. Portable X-ray fluorescence, PXRF, and, where necessary, lab-based chemistry tie cores and blades to volcanic fields, Paravani, Chikiani, Arteni, Gutansar, and others, mapping social ties as much as geology. In upland stations, we often find curated, repaired pieces, drilled staple holes along a pot crack, resinous mends on a haft, pine pitch or birch tar, sometimes mixed with beeswax, glues stone to wood. Under GCMS, those resins reveal biomarkers: betulin from birch tar, abietanes from conifers, quiet proof that adhesive craft traveled with people as surely as blades did. Sickles enter the scene when low plots turn gold. Many are composites, a gently curved wood or antler spine with slots cut to receive microlith inserts bedded in pitch. Useware labs see harvest in two voices, a bright, invasive polish that climbs over the edge of flint or obsidian teeth, and the micro-scarring that cereal stalks cause as blades meet silica bodies. Starch granules and phytoliths, recovered from the sickle's ragged sockets or the gloss itself, whisper species, barley, einkorn, wild grasses that keep company in field edges. Some sickles carry a second story, a different zone of polish from cutting reeds for thatch and basketry later in the season, or scars from pruning woody stems. Repair is constant, inserts loosen. People warm the spine by the fire, pull a tooth, clean pitch with a sliver, press a fresh blade, and return to work. In a mosaic economy, maintenance is a survival skill. Woodworking tools round out the middle months. Adzes and chisels of stone glued into short, stout hafts shape posts, troughs, and sled runners. Their polishes are duller, broad, with striations that run with the edge rather than across it. Percussion scars are larger and more scattered than on cutting tools. When a hamlet renews a wall of wattle-and-daub, the tool scatter thickens, long blades snapped to useful lengths, expedient scrapers with minimal retouch, a field of tiny flakes where a napper sat cross-legged in the doorway to fix what broke, the way a modern household mends while talking. These are not formal workshops. They are living rooms whose surfaces remember hands. Grinding stones anchor autumn and winter. A quern's story lies in its curve. Early saddles are shallow, then deepen as families lean into them for years. On their faces, starch granules lodge in microscopic pits. On their shoulders, oil from hands darkens the stone. Around them, a skirt of grit settles where flour and sand shed. Residue analysts coax out plant traces, starch from barley and oat, sometimes from legumes, occasionally from acorns and beech nuts if people ground mast into meal. The polish on the handstone edges differs from the center, a crescent of gloss where fingers pushed hardest. A ground stone does not pick sides in our myth. It works for grain, nuts, pigments, and temper crushed for clay. It is a generalist, like the households that use it. Hides and fibers keep company with cold. Scrapers with steep, plano-convex edges take on a luminous, greasy sheen after many hours of dressing skins. The polishes are patchy, sometimes corrugated where soft tissue clung. Needles and awls of bone, polished to a soft glow by thread and in hand, tell of stitching that tethers tents and clothes to weather. A spindle whorl appears in some basins by our window. Elsewhere, cordage and plating carry the load. Basketry leaves shallow imprints in daub and clay lids, a reverse relief of daily weave. Where preservation smiles, fiber fragments hide in dry shelters or waterlogged pits. Textiles and baskets are archaeology's shy performers. When they do appear, they pull the whole kit into sharper focus. You don't cut grain without carrying it. You don't carry without cordage and woven walls. Two organizational threads bind these tools. First, curation versus expediency. Curated pieces, finely made, repaired, carried, cluster in upland stations and along travel corridors. Expedient pieces, quick flakes, minimally retouched, bloom in harvest and building episodes when time tightens. Second, taskscapes. A hamlet's taskscape in late summer clusters grinding stones, sickles, and storage pits. A rock shelters and spring clusters netgear, light but sharp edges, and small fire spots for smoking. Mapping tool types across space and season shows habits without requiring us to label households as forager or farmer. They are both at different hours. Consensus in regional work is broad on this tandem. Microlithic traditions persist alongside groundstone and sickles through the 6th millennium BCE, with local pacing. In some valleys, formal blade production wanes earlier. In others, pressure-flaked inserts remain the harvest norm while ceramics and herds thicken. Minority views argue that, in a few basins, the appearance of pottery and domesticates coincides with a marked drop in microlith use, an inflection toward heavier ground tools and fewer light composite weapons. Those cases are real and important, often tied to geomorphology that favors fields over upland circuits. The wider pattern, however, is coexistence borne out by useware spreads and the presence of both curated and expedient elements within the same households. Methods knit these claims together. Microware analysts build reference libraries by using replica tools on known materials, then comparing the resulting polishes to archaeological edges, an experimental patience that keeps adjectives honest. Starch and phytolith recovery on edges and in gloss add species-level nuance when preservation allows. Residue chemistry on hafts and sockets identifies adhesives and tars. PXRF and lab geochemistry trace obsidian flows, turning black glass into a social map. Spatial analysis of microdebitage shows where people sat to nap and repair, often at thresholds and hearth edges, giving rooms functions beyond walls alone. The result is not a list of objects, but a lived choreography. Ethical note: tool studies often hinge on microsampling adhesives, removing slivers from sockets, or washing gentle residues from gloss. We do this with restraint, documenting every cut, using the smallest possible amounts, and returning all images and spectra to shared archives. When communities prefer non-destructive approaches, we switch to high magnification optical work, reflectance spectroscopy, and targeted photogrammetry, accepting that some questions will stay open. Uncertainty box. Sickle gloss can form on reeds as well as cereals. Context and micro-residues must arbitrate. Starch granule deform with heat and pressure. Identifications carry probabilities, not certainties. Obsidian sourcing with PXRF can blur closely related flows. Laboratory confirmation is sometimes needed. Micro-wear signatures overlap at the edges of categories, soft wood versus tough plants. Analysts' experience matters, and inter-observer tests keep confidence grounded. Finally, curated tools travel. Finding a Paravani blade in a lowland hamlet marks a route, not a person's identity. Gather the pieces back onto the blanket. What sits before you is not a toolkit marching from wild to domestic. It is a set of solutions to a landscape of stacked choices. Light composite edges for mobility and repair, ground stones for patience and storage, sickles for fields that do not cover the horizon, scrapers and needles for clothes and skins that make altitude tolerable, net gear for hours when water pays better than earth. The corridor rewards such plural competence, and the tools remember it. In the next part, we'll put these tools back into rooms, houses, hearths, pits, reading quiet architecture, to see how walls, floors, and fire organize the year without raising monuments. Step inside a house that does not insist on being remembered. It sits low to the ground, round or softly oval. Its walls a weave of sticks daubed with clay and straw. Its roof a shallow cone of reeds or brush pinned with poles. No foundations of stone, no street plan incised into earth. Yet every surface carries intention. The doorway faces a slope that drains well. The roof's drip line darkens the soil in a neat ring. A small yard outside shows ash scars the wind could not lift. Quiet architecture for a mixed year. Floors are the house's diary. The first floor is simply trampled earth. The second gains a smear of clay that smooths dust. Later, a scatter of char and crushed shells stiffens the surface. Another resurfacing adds a thin layer of silt from the riverbank, hauled up in baskets and laid wet, then tamped with the flat of a handstone. Thin sections of these floors, micromorphologies, glass slices, turn living into thin, bright bands. Trampled phytoliths from grasses, dung spherolites where a kid pen once stood, streaks of ash raked and re-raked, punctures where a post wobbled and was wedged tight with chaff. Under a microscope, a floor is not a surface but a stack of days. Post holes map the negative space of walls. In plan, they arc gently, often in pairs where a split upright once straddled the line of the wall. At the entrance, posts thicken or cluster, supporting a porch or a simple lean-to that caught tools and drying herbs. Here and there, a double post betrays repair. The first rotted. The second was planted just inside the line, a quiet narrowing accepted without comment. Clay daub fallen from walls preserves fingerprints, cord impressions from the wattles, faint marks of a reed mat lean to cure in the shade. Sometimes it carries a whisper of color, iron-rich blotches that hint at a wash of red slipped on feast days, or simply the memory of firing unevenly when the hearth ran hot. Hearths speak in circles and ovals, lined with stones, or cut as shallow dishes into the floor. Some are central, others hug the leeward side of the room. Their ash lenses stack like fine sediment, each firing a layer. A gray of cool wood, a black where fat flared, a patch of reddened soil where heat ran high. Hearthstones crack in ways that tell of thermal stress. Their undersides darken with soot. In micromorphology, rubefaction, red, heat-altered clay, makes a halo under and around the fire spot, a signature that endures when stones wander. Small hearths recur in rock shelters and summer stations. Broad, long-lived hearths sit in hamlets, their rims repaired with fresh clay and subtle steps. A household that keeps more than one menu often keeps more than one fire, a steady simmer for grain and milk, a quick, hot spot for fish and meat. Pits gather functions the way valleys gather water. Storage pits sit just outside the door or along an interior wall, bell-shaped, with narrow mouths and wider bellies, lined with clay or basketry impressions. Their fills tell how they ended, cleanly backfilled when a house was closed, or slowly choked with sweepings, ash, broken sherds, nutshell, fish bones, and the odd bead a child cried over. Refuse pits are messier, patched, redug, their edges irregular, and the soil dark with organic runoff. In wetter basins, some pits hold anaerobic secrets: seeds, worked wood, a mat's imprint. In drier fans, pits are signals more than archives, their contents wine-frayed and sun-bleached. A careful plan view of a house often shows a choreography: fire inboard, storage outboard, refuse in the wind's path, a trample path between door and quern, polished darker than its neighbors. Rooms are zones more than rectangles. A heavy grinding stone anchors one side. Around it the floor grows slick, and a skirt of grit accumulates. Near the doorway, the micro-debitage halo of pressure-flaking glitters, repair done in good light with an eye on passing goats. Against the wall, a low bench of packed earth or a row of stones serves as seat and shelf. A child's toy, an animal shaped from clay, a broken bead, slips between floor layers to join the archaeologist's future tray of small finds. Dogs mark corners. Phosphate mapping lights them up decades later like lanterns. The house breathes. It is mended, re-skinned, re-floored, its life measured in the depth of its floor stack rather than in walls that aspire to last. Outside, yurds take on character. A drying rack leaves 4 paired post holes in a neat rectangle. A fish-splitting area is inferred from thin scatters of small vertebrae and a dark line where a gutter carried blood away on busy days. A corral post ringed by trample hardens the soil, its phosphate bright from nights when kids slept close in stormy weather. The drip line of the roof grows a mossy ring that holds seeds. When we float samples from that zone, we capture the weed community of a household, plants that thrive in disturbed soils near ash and trample. Domesticity here is not the invention of walls. It is the repeated sorting of space into tasks that make sense together. Survey and geophysics add the quiet, wide view. Magnetometry over a terrace hamlet picks up hearths as magnetic halos, pits as punctuations, ditches as linear whispers. Resistivity sees old floors as dense plates, wetter soil and pits as softer patches. What emerges is seldom a grid. It is clusters, 2 or 3 houses with overlapping yards, a shared open space that blackens with hearth rake out, then a gap, then another cluster. Pathways curve, respecting microtopography and water. Replacement narratives like straight lines. Mixed lifeways like curves that work around what the land gives. Consensus among researchers who work these basins is that early house forms are light, rounded, and variable, with rebuilding common and multi-purpose yards integral to daily life. Semi-subterranean rooms appear in some valleys, useful where summers run hot and winters bite. Elsewhere, raised floors over brush keep damp at bay. Minority views note local episodes of more formal planning, short runs of rectilinear rooms, small compounds with shared walls, and more substantial pisces suggesting increasing investment, sometimes coincident with pulses of cereal and caprine remains. The gradient can thicken into something village-like, then thin again a century later when rivers shift or fields tire. Architecture participates in the mosaic. It does not dictate it. Methods keep our reading honest. Micromorphology distinguishes a trampled surface from a deliberately laid floor, dung ash from wood ash, a single burn from dozens. Phosphate mapping and portable XRF trace activity zones, where artifacts alone are coy. Magnetic susceptibility ties heating events to places no stones remain. Use wear and residue on daub and floor fragments catch brushwood species, chaff temper, and dung inclusions. Bayesian sequencing wraps dates around these features so that House life has a beginning and an end that match the archaeology, not our impatience. Site formation adds needed caution. Floods smear plans, burrowing animals perforate floors. Later plows slice through pits, turning their neat profiles into ragged puzzles. Roofs collapse unevenly. Daub fires in the fall, turning a house into a low, brick-red dome that misleads surveyors into thinking of kilns. We learn a valley's specific taphonomy the way families learned its seasons, by repetition and attention, and we calibrate our expectations accordingly. Ethical note: houses are intimate. When we lift floors and empty pits, we touch places where infants took first steps and elders warmed hands in winter. We document with drawings, photographs, and 3D models so that the record remains visible to those whose ancestors built here. Where communities ask that structures be left partly intact, we phase our work, sample minimally, and return surfaces to protection when seasons turn. Uncertainty box. How many households share a cluster of post holes? Overlapping rebuilds can masquerade as multiple houses. Micromorphology and stratigraphic control help, but do not eliminate ambiguity. Are bell-shaped pits always for storage? Some become coolers, smoke pits, or ritual repositories, contents and lining matter. Can we distinguish goat pens from trash zones reliably? Phosphates and spherolites guide us, but heavy use of dung as fuel blurs lines. Do geophysical absences indicate real gaps or instrument limits in stony soils? We temper maps with test trenches and humility. Stand in the doorway for a last look. The room is small, warm, and unfussy. A quern sits quiet. A jar on its side shows men's older than the season. The hearth holds yesterday's heat. Outside, a path arcs toward the river. Another climbs toward the meadow. The house does not ask you to choose one. It was built to serve both. In the next part, we'll lift the story from rooms to genes, ancient DNA why, kin, flow, and language caveats, and listen for how ancestry threads through the corridor without mistaking biology for speech. Set a tooth on velvet and the room gets quieter. Inside its hardest tissues, especially the dense inner ear bone, the petrous, tiny fragments of ancient DNA sometimes survive like pressed flowers between pages. We open them carefully, knowing that each milligram is unrepeatable, that each result is a probability, not a name. Tonight we let genomes speak softly about kin, movement, and the limits of what biology can tell us about words. Begin with how we listen. In a clean room that smells faintly of bleach, bone powder becomes a slurry. Enzymes open cell remnants. Silica binds DNA, washes clear what does not belong. Treatments with uracil DNA glycosylase, UDG, trime. Some of the damage that time writes into strands, yet we leave a signature at the ends, short, CT scars, that proves the molecules are truly old. Libraries are built with barcodes so we can tell one person from another, even when tubes share a sequencer's lane. Sometimes we shotgun sequence everything. More often we enrich for a panel of informative single nucleotide polymorphisms. Hundreds of thousands of small genetic switches spread across the genome. These arrays, along with mitochondrial genomes and, when coverage allows, Y chromosome markers, give us enough resolution to place individuals on population maps without asking their bones to give more than they can. Contamination checks are our first guardians. Mitochondrial consensus must be tidy. X chromosome patterns in presumed male individuals should not look female. Terminal damage must be present. Negative controls must be clean. When bones are few, we err on the side of refusal. Better to say not enough than to lean on noise. Petrous bones yield best, but teeth can be kind. Long bones, especially from wet contexts, are often quiet. Each valley sets its own success rate. Once we have data, we ask gentle questions. Principal components analysis, PCA, places individuals in a broad genetic landscape defined by many present-day and past populations. It is a sketch, not a verdict. F statistics, F3 and F4 in various arrangements, test shared drift. Who resembles whom, and is there evidence of mixture? QPADM fits mixture models that propose proportions of ancestry from source-like groups, with caveats that source-like is not true source. Admixture paints clusters of shared variation, useful as long as we remember that clusters reflect the dataset as much as history. Kinship tools, read, LCM-LKIN, measure relatedness within a site, parent-child, siblings, cousins. Runs of homozygosity hint at small effective population sizes or endogamy. Sex-biased signals, mitochondrial versus Y patterns, can suggest whether movements involved more women, more men, or both. What then do genomes say along a corridor where foragers and herders coexisted? The short, careful answer from sites with data in the wider region is that ancestry threads are braided rather than replaced. Individuals dated to the 6th and 5th millennia BCE in and around the Caucasus often carry mixtures of ancestries. Some strands that link to earlier forager groups of the region, other strands more common among communities south and west, where domesticates and pottery had deeper histories. The proportions vary by valley and century. In some hamlets with early pottery and caprines, genomes still show significant continuity with earlier local foragers, consistent with adoption or partnership rather than displacement. In others, new strands become more visible over time, consistent with marriages, fosterage, or small groups settling in. Kinship within sites is instructive. Burial clusters sometimes include first-degree relatives resting a few meters apart. Other cemeteries hold many individuals with no close kin ties, hinting at communities that gathered beyond blood. Neighbors, affines, or households in seasonal union. Sex ratios in sampled burials can mislead because preservation and practices are uneven, but in some assemblages we see patterns compatible with exogamy, women arriving from elsewhere, men more locally rooted, or the reverse in other places. These are not laws, they are local notes that match a mosaic of paths and marriages stretching along passes. Genomes do not come with languages attached. It is tempting, dangerously easy, to map ancestry components onto language families present today or attested later. We resist that. Words travel with trade, marriage, prestige, and practical advantage as well as with people. A child can grow up speaking a neighbor's tongue while carrying the genome of grandparents who lived 2 valleys away. The corridor, with its short repeated trips and its layered economies, invites multilingualism and borrowing. When we encounter genetic shifts, we will not pronounce on speech. At best, we can say that the contacts required for borrowing were present. People met often enough to share both genes and goods. Consensus among researchers is broad on one point that matters for our story. The Neolithic in and around the Caucasus is characterized by gene flow that is real but complex, not a single incoming stream washing earlier residents away. Continuity and admixture co-occur. Minority views propose more punctuated demographic events in specific basins, periods when incoming groups may have been numerically dominant for a time. Where the archaeology shows sharper turns, rapid densification of hamlets, swift rises in domesticates, these views deserve a hearing. The weight of current data, however, favors fine-grained, multi-source interactions over sweeping replacement. Ancient pathogens and microbiomes add quiet footnotes. Dental calculus, mineralized plaque, preserves proteins and DNA from diets and microbes. Milk proteins, V. lactoglobulin, show up in some mouths by the late 6th millennium BCE, a molecular conformation of dairying that complements lipids in pots. Oral microbiomes shift with diet and crowding. We treat such signals gingerly. Preservation is fickle, and calculus sampling is as intimate as it sounds. Still, when a milk peptide appears in a person whose enamel says upland summers, the strands braid convincingly, a child of the corridor. Ethical note: ancient DNA is powerful and easy to misunderstand. We do not sample without permits, local partnership, and community consent. We pre-register plans where possible, publish negative results alongside positive, and return data in open formats. When remains are sacred or few, we pause. Kinship revelations can touch living stories. We share them privately before they appear in print, and we avoid framing results as judgments on identity. Curiosity does not take precedence over care. Uncertainty box. Sampling is small and uneven. A handful of genomes can sing loudly simply because they are the only ones audible. Preservation biases skew who speaks: rock shelters, dry caves, and petrous bones over open-air burials. QPADM models are sensitive to reference choices. Change the scaffold and proportions shift. Source-like does not mean source. Kinship calls at low coverage carry error bars, especially for second-degree ties. Sex-biased admixture inferences lean on uniparental markers that can drift in small groups. Finally, aligning genetic pulses with pots or herd profiles risks circularity. We guard against this by testing multiple independent alignments and embracing mismatches as information, not failures. Set the tooth back on its velvet. What we carry forward is modest but meaningful. Families formed across passes and rivers, ancestries braided at a human scale, kin near and far sharing small rooms and large views. The genomes do not overwrite the mosaic we have been walking. They add threads and knots, tiny signatures that match households who learned two trails and kept both open. In the next part, we'll step away from molecules to the ground's own edits, rivers edit, site formation, and sampling bias, and reckon with how water and time curate what we find and what we fail to see. To keep our footing, we need an audit. What the river keeps too well, what it hides too eagerly, and which habits of our own magnify or mute those biases. Tonight we'll open the ledger calmly, line by line, and mark where uncertainty lives and how we might shrink it. Hydrological selection, where currents curate. Rivers are not neutral shelves. Bends scour, outside banks cut, inside banks collect. Eddies act like careful hands, cradling articulated joints and light things. Thalwigs behave like impatient arms, dragging and breaking. In practice, this means that hotspots of bone and artifact density often coincide with geomorphic keep spots, slack pockets below narrows, lee sides of obstacles, and relic channels that sip rather than gulp. A single violent flood can peel the top of a terrace clean, tumble sherds down a short cliff, and restack them 3 meters away in a lens that looks like a floor until you notice the lack of hearth rubefaction or post-hole logic. The river edits for us. We must not mistake its editorial flourish for human planning. Material selectivity. What lasts is not what lived. Low-fired pottery survives better than basketry. Stone survives better than bone in acidic soils. Robust long bones last longer than fish spines and bird bones. Charred cereal grains can outlast uncharred seeds by millennia. Nutshell fragments do well if carbonized. Wood almost never, unless it sleeps in anoxic silt. This selectivity produces diets on paper that are meat and grain heavy, even when real meals included greens, bulbs, and fish in generous amounts. When lipid chemistry whispers fish and our screens show few fish bones, we should remember that fine vertebrae shatter under trampling and drift out of sieves if mesh is too coarse, or never enter sieves at all when field time runs tight. Vertical palimpsests, floods, and floors. Open-air hamlets on fans and low terraces accumulate like layered conversations. A late spring flood lays silt across a yard. A family tampers the surface and keeps living. Years later, a second flood carries in pebbles, cutting the yard's old micro-relief into faint shadows. When we excavate, we find neat lines only where we slice thin. If we dig too broadly, contexts smear into each other, and Bayesian models obediently report a blur we ourselves created. Thin section micromorphology helps separate trample from flood silt, dung ash from wood ash, and use surfaces from natural crusts. Without it, the site reads smoother and wronger than it should. Lateral palimpsests, channels that wander. Side channels migrate across decades, abandoning small levees, drowning others, and turning yesterday's storage pit into today's point bar. A scatter of sherds on a gravel tongue can be a picnic, a dump, or a river's collage. Spatial statistics, nearest neighbor analysis, refit studies of broken vessels, orientation of long bones, flag transport. If sherd refits occur across 10 meters with edges rounded and orientations aligned to flow, we are reading water, not people. If refits cluster within a meter, with sharp edges and ash underfoot, we are reading a room. Wetland kindness, wetland traps. Peat and anoxic silts are archaeologists' friends and tricksters. They keep wood, seeds, basketry, and even footprints, but they move edges and blur lines. A trackway slumps, posts tilt, a dump spreads as peat compacts unevenly. Radiocarbon dates from such contexts can skew if roots thread through or if dissolved carbonates sneak in with groundwater. Pre-treatment and paired dating, short-lived seeds plus twig charcoal, help, but the bigger remedy is cautious stratigraphic recording and humility in interpreting smeared horizons as events. Our own filters, methods as bias. Mesh size on sieves sets the lower bound of what we admit as real. Sendenesis zinastes as real. A 5 mm mesh lets fish spines, small seeds, and delicate bird bones slip by. A 2 mm mesh keeps them. Flotation that is too brief or too coarse loses weed seeds that map fields and rooterals that map yards. Trench placement gravitates to high, dry ground where preservation is worse for organics but better for walls, biasing us toward architecture over cuisine. Survey walks prefer plowed fields and road cuts. Rock shelters get more test pits than marsh islands. Each of these choices leans the record. Naming them is the first step to leaning back. Time averaging and busy surfaces. An area littered with sherds from 3 centuries can look like a thriving market when it is really a thin palimpsest. Bayesian models can compress or stretch such time if we feed them unstructured dates. They reward explicit phasing tied to micro-contexts. We should resist the temptation to pour all hearth-adjacent material into one phase. A small rake-out lens, dated by a trio of charred grains and anchored by a patch of rubefaction, tells a truer story than a warehouse category called domestic. Erosion, shadows, and modern overprints. Gullies cut through terrace edges after heavy summer storms, exposing beautiful but treacherous profiles where layers have sagged. Modern plows ripple subsoil, smearing pits into enigmatic blotches. Bulldozers for flood defenses scrape into older channels. A new track drains a marsh, oxidizing what had been safe for centuries. Our notebooks must include these modern edits, mapped with the same care as hearths. Otherwise, we will mistake a bulldozer's bite for an ancient ditch, or a gully's slump for a courtyard. Taphonomic asymmetry between upland and lowland. Rock shelters and high stations overpreserve stone and fire, but underpreserve the soft vocabulary of daily life. Floodplain sites overpreserve organics and pockets, but lose plan coherence. When we compare toolkits and menus across belts, we should normalize for these asymmetries. Use denser mesh and flotation in lowlands. Invest in micromorphology and residue work in uplands. Be explicit that absences are often the river's quiet veto rather than cultural abandonment. How do we push back? Pair lines of evidence. Read lipids with bones, bones with microbotanical residues, residues with stratified dates. If 2 independent lines agree in a fragile context, confidence rises. Map geomorphology first. Walk with a fluvial geologist. Draft paleochannels. Core floodplains to see buried surfaces before you trench. Place trenches to cross-process boundaries, from levee to back swamp, from fan apex to toe. Sample systematically. Grid your sieving decisions, vary mesh sizes, record negative results. Archive soils for future tests we cannot yet imagine. Model responsibly. Use outlier models for old wood. Define phases by micro-contexts. Test alternative priors. Publish the models, not just the medians. Accept silence honestly. Write unknown where the river erased the page. Do not recruit tidy stories to fill the gap. Ethical note. Rivers are present tense. Communities fish them today, irrigate fields from them, and remember floods that carried away houses. Excavation that weakens banks or opens peat to oxidation has present costs. We work with local water managers, avoid cutting stabilizing roots, backfill with care, and share hazard maps and findings that may help neighbors plan. Respect for the living river is part of respecting the past it keeps. Uncertainty box. Freshwater reservoir effects can still bend radiocarbon even when we think we've corrected them. Offsets vary within a single drainage and across seasons. APAAs, aquatic lipid markers, form under prolonged heating. Short cooks may leave no chemical trace, and fish bones may still be absent in coarse sieving. Micromorphology samples are small windows. We can miss a floor patch 2 hands away and misread a room. Paleochannels migrate in decades. A model built on today's topography may misplace yesterday's bank. Solution: replication across trenches, basins, and teams. Standardized reporting of negative finds, and cross-training so that excavators recognize fluvial signatures in the moment, not months later at a desk. Set the ledger down. The river has edited our archive, but not beyond legibility. If we know where its hand is heavy and where our own habits add ink, we can read the corridor with steadier eyes. The mosaic of foragers and herders is not a mirage of preservation. It is a pattern robust enough to survive the current's fussing. In the next part, we'll step from processes to people, feasts, gifts, and paths, social glue. and watch how shared meals, traded jars, and walked routes stitched households into corridors that carried ideas as readily as goats. Imagine a clearing on a terrace where the wind drops and voices can pool. Smoke holds close, blue and slow. A broad pit glows with stones that have been heating since afternoon. Around it, jars squat like patient animals. A rack leans with sprigs of herbs gathered from the slope. Skins hang from a line, already losing their water. When dusk settles, the first pot tips, and a thick stew, meat, a little grain, a handful of greens, spills into a shallow bowl that will make the rounds. This is not subsistence. This is glue. Feasts stitch households to each other and to the corridor. They concentrate calories and attention, pull distant kin and neighbors into the same breath, and turn gifts into memory. In a landscape where families hedge bets across fields, groves, and meadows, feasts do double work. They redistribute risk and reaffirm routes. Tomorrow's help with a weir repair is easier to ask when tonight's stew warmed everyone's hands. Archaeology recognizes feasts by clusters that feel larger than every day. Oversized cooking pits with reddened rims and cracked stones. Heaps of bones from many animals culled on the same day. Jars bigger than a small household could lift alone. Serving bowls that multiply in a single layer. Cut marks shift from careful butchery to brisk disarticulation. Bone ends show cracking from marrow shared at the moment rather than saved. In some valleys, ash dumps are broader and darker at spots where paths meet, communal eating at crossroads rather than in narrow yards. If we sample lipids from big jars in such contexts, ruminant adipose dominates. Sometimes dairy rides along, an enrichment rather than the base. Botanical remains show pulses of grain that outsize any one family's plot, with weed seeds from several fields mixed in. A palimpsest of neighbors' soils carried in on stalks. Feasts also travel up the stair. At summer stations, where milk peaks, gatherings turn lactation into community. Curds pressed in fresh leaves, cheeses salted for walks down, fermented drinks that take the chill off night. These foods carry flavor and obligation. A cousin who kept the herd high shares with a cousin who kept the crops safe. The balance flips later at harvest. Material traces here are lighter but legible. Large, repaired vessels hauled uphill and mended. Dung mats layered thicker than a small family would make. A spike in small stock bones culled at the right age for meat, not just dairy support. A row of tethering pegs and a ring of sitting stones tell of a circle that widened for a few nights. Gifts move along the same paths. A bead of soft green stone from a river a day away. A blade core of obsidian whose chemistry points to a plateau 2 passes distant. A jar traded for the vessel itself, the paste and rim admired as much as any content. Such objects are not luxury in the modern sense. They are messages, tokens of presence, competence, and care. When a hamlet adopts a new paste recipe or rim roll after a visit from in-laws, the clay keeps a record of a relationship. PXRF links obsidian to sources. Petrography in thin section ties pottery to tempers that crunch under the microscope like a tiny gravel of a specific valley. The map that results looks like a delicate web, not a highway. Short links repeated often, with a few long threads glinting in the light. Paths themselves harden under feet. Waypoints bloom where springs meet passes. A flat rock polished by years of jars resting. Charred hazelnut shells under a small overhang where travelers paused. A scatter of flint chips from quick repairs. Ethnographers would talk of down-the-line exchange, where goods move in hops, each neighbor passing a little further, value accumulating as distance does. Our corridor practices a version of this at human scale. An obsidian flake found in a Piedmont hamlet, 10 small swaps from its source. A jar shape that drifts valley by valley, until, 5 generations later, it looks local, in a place that once saw it as novelty. The rhythm is not a caravan, it is a conversation. Feasts can signal more than comfort. They can mark thresholds, first harvest, a marriage tying 2 valleys, the successful return from summer pastures. In faunal piles, we sometimes find animals that do not fit routine culling. An older male goat culled late, a prized ram shared in a way that says status and generosity together. Horn cores kept whole, set along a wall, mandibles cleaned and strung along a beam. Decorations that make speech in winter rooms. We stay cautious here. Not every odd bone is symbolic. But when repetition settles, horns in the same corner across floors, a consistent way of placing skull fragments near entrances, We note the habit as a local grammar of display. Paths carry news as surely as goods. A flood took the lower plots on the Kura side. Mast is heavy 2 valleys west. A leopard was seen near the notch. Such news shapes risk and invitation. If a hamlet knows that masts boom over the ridge, a feast can be planned. If a cousin brings word of a safe ford after a bank collapse, a trade rendezvous shifts. The archaeological trace of news is thin, a redistribution pit larger than usual, a sudden appearance of reed thatch from a far marsh. But when mapped across features and decades, a pattern emerges. Nodal places, passes, fords, confluences show more feasting debris across time than hamlets tucked into side fans. Corridors have kitchens. Consent and cooperation are not guaranteed. Feasts can exclude as well as include. Gifts can bind unevenly. The corridor's mosaic includes tension handled by custom, bride service, herd loans, shared rights to a grove. These social contracts leave indirect signatures. In some burial grounds, grave goods show a narrow, homely range, beads of shell from nearby shores, a favorite tool, while elsewhere, a few graves hold distant obsidian in jars and alien pastes. We resist stories of hierarchy too early, but we also resist flattening. Even small differences can be consequential in a valley where bad summers test bonds. Consensus in regional scholarship supports the role of feasting and gift exchange as social glue in early mixed economies. Large roasting pits, unusual faunal concentrations, oversized vessels, and mixed provenance assemblages cluster at nodal points of movement, passes and river confluences, more than at isolated hamlets. Minority views caution that some feast signatures are time-averaged dumps, that oversized vessels might be storage, not serving, and that distant obsidian can arrive through a chain of casual trades without implying ceremonial corridors. Those cautions sharpen our eye. We look for co-occurrence, big pits plus many bowls, special culls plus repaired traveling jars, before we name a feast. Methods make the case sturdy. Zoo archaeology reads culling profiles and body part distributions. Lipid analysis in large jars cross-checks the menu. Ceramic petrography and PXRF anchor provenances. Spatial statistics test whether concentrations are real or the rivers shuffle. Bayesian models pin pulses in time, so that gathering is not just a century's worth of sweepings. Ancient DNA adds small threads, a guest buried far from their childhood baseline, perhaps a spouse from over a pass. Mitochondrial lineages suggesting women moved in certain directions in one century, men in another. None of these methods alone prove social glue. Together, they make it tacky enough to hold. Ethical note: feasts and gifts are living practices around these mountains. Communities today gather at passes, springs, and summer stations. They share milk and meat. They exchange vessels and stories. When we name ancient feasts, we do so with respect and without collapsing past and present. We share our results locally, invite memories that may offer parallels or corrections, and accept that some places are not for trenching. Present kitchens outrank our curiosity about older ones. Uncertainty, box. Oversized pits can be kilns or earth ovens. Distinguishing them leans on heat signatures, lining, and associated finds. Bone heaps can collect over years. Tight radiocarbon clusters and refits help narrow episodes. Petrographic match is not a fingerprint. Similar tempers recur across basins. Obsidian sources can overlap in PXRF space. Lab confirmation is sometimes needed. Social reading of grave goods is slippery. Small samples and preservation bias can magnify accidents. We answer with replication across sites and with a refusal to press thin evidence into thick claims. Return to the clearing. The stew's surface has gone glossy. The air tastes of fat and time. Bowls make their rounds. A bead changes hands and then disappears into a pouch. Someone tests a new rim with a thumb and nods, already thinking of clay nearer home. When the embers dim, paths brighten. The ones down to river fans, the ones up toward bells and morning grass. The feast leaves a ring of ash and a memory of voices, both of which our trowels and tests can find if we know where to listen. In the next part, we'll slow our pace for uncertainties why, tempo, bestiae, triggers, and missing valleys, naming the questions that still stand, and the kinds of evidence most likely to bring them gently within reach. Set the lamp low and spread the maps again. We've walked ridges and floors, listened to pots and teeth. wade river edits and feast fires. The gradient we've traced, long coexistence of foragers and herders, fields and nets, is sturdy enough to lean on. Still, there are places where our footing slips. Tonight we'll mark those slopes plainly and sketch the kinds of evidence that would make them safer to cross. Question 1. How fast did mixed economies thicken, and did tempo differ by belt? Our timelines show overlaps, cereals with nets, dairy with fish, but the pace at which mixing becomes expected remains blurry. In some piedmont basins, the first firm pulses of domestic caprines and pottery are followed by a century of light, seasonal use rather than quick densification. Elsewhere, say house floors stack rapidly, pits multiply, and domestic refuse deepens in 2 generations. Are these genuinely different tempos, or artifacts of dating plateaus and uneven sampling? What would help? Tighter Bayesian models built from many short-lived samples. Charred grains, nutshells, twig charcoal, taken from micro-contexts, individual resurfacing episodes, discrete rakeouts. Wiggle matching of subfossil wood where possible. More paired dates on human animal bones and grains within the same features to watch freshwater reservoir effects in real time. Publication of negative dates and failed pre-treatments to see where silence is methodological rather than cultural. Question 2. Were seasonal moves household-wide, or did tasks split by age and kin? Strontium and oxygen swing with seasons in some children. Goats show the same swing in their enamel, but do whole households climb? Or do herders and a subset of kin go high while others guard fields and weirs? Our present resolution often averages practice. What would help? Enamel transects across multiple teeth from the same individuals combined with goat and sheep enamel from the same households. Human herd dyads rather than human alone. Isotope sampling by sex and age class within cemeteries, paired with kinship analyses, ancient DNA, to see if related individuals share movement patterns. Seasonal markers in dung mats, pollen spectra, insect fragments, at summer stations tightly dated to specific years rather than pooled across phases. Question 3. How early and how systematic was dairying across belts? Lipids point to dairy in some upland vessels. Milk proteins flicker in calculus for a few mouths. Kill-off curves fit herd management. Yet the onset of regular milk processing and its spread from upland to lowland remains unevenly pinned. What would help? Larger, context-rich lipid datasets that sample many sherds within single features, not one per site, with compound-specific isotope analyses to separate dairy from adipose in mixed stews. Proteomic surveys of dental calculus across age groups, looking for V-lactoglobulin and caseins in children versus adults. Experimental reference fats from modern goats and sheep grazing local C3 floras at different altitudes and seasons, to anchor D13C thresholds to local diets rather than imported ranges. Question 4. What were the demographic mechanics? Steady trickles, stepping stone settlements, or episodic pulses? Genomes suggest admixture and continuity, thread by thread, but we still lack the sampling density to see whether movement came mainly via marriage networks and small households, or whether occasional founding groups seeded new hamlets that then braided into locals. What would help? Denser aDNA transects within single valleys, emphasizing humble contexts, scattered burials, disarticulated remains, rather than only formal cemeteries. Systematic kinship mapping within hamlets across layers. Can we see multi-generation lineages in place? And do they recruit spouses from one direction consistently? Sex-biased signals, mitochondrial versus Y, read alongside material culture changes to test whether pottery or herd practices correlate with the arrival of people versus the exchange of ideas. Question 5. Where are the missing valleys? Fieldwork clusters where roads, permits, and preservation cooperate. That leaves shadows, steep tributaries, marsh islands, high saddles, undersampled and overimagined. Our regional narratives risk being well-studied valley narratives in disguise. What would help? Predictive survey built on geomorphology and remote sensing, LiDAR in forested piedmonts to reveal low rings and trackways, coring transects across floodplains to find buried surfaces before trenching, small, systematic test pits with fine mesh and marsh edge ridges, funding and time for quiet places, no monuments, just floors and pits, publication venues that value null results. We looked here and found little, so the map of absence is as explicit as presence. Question 6. How did climate pulses nudge choices without dictating them? Mid-Holocene warmth lengthened high pasture windows. Moisture gradients split west from east. Yet, climate made them do it is too coarse. We want the grain of lived weather. Late frosts that ruined a valley's barley twice in 5 years. Hailstorms that pushed herds down early. What would help? High-resolution local paleoclimate proxies. Lake cores with annual laminations where possible. Speleothem isotope series from caves near sampled valleys. Tree ring series from later, but regionally homologous, contexts to model variants. Bayesian models that include paleoclimate priors as soft constraints when sequencing site phases, while guarding against forcing the past into tidy alignments. Question 7. Did ritual or signaling drive any early adoptions? A new rim form may be a fashion. A first dairy-rich feast could be a deliberate performance. The corridor's social glue, feasts, gifts, paths, suggests that prestige could hitch a ride with pots and milk. What would help? Contextual reads of firsts. Is the earliest dairy signal at a site embedded in an oversized pit with many bowls? Do early exotic obsidians cluster in nodal places more than in homely floors? Protein residues on special vessels versus cooking jars. Residue sampling of display pieces. Spatial analysis that tests whether new forms debuted at crossroads before reaching hamlet kitchens. Methodological guardrails to keep us honest. Multi-proxy or pause. We treat single lines, lipids, isotopes, genomes, as invitations, not verdicts. 2 independent agreements make a claim sturdy, 3 make it calm. Micro-context first. Dates, residues, and isotopes are strongest when tied to features small enough to live in. A floor patch, a hearth lens, a pit fill that we can draw with a pencil and remember with a photograph. Publish the scaffolding, release priors, outlier settings, blank controls, failed samples, and raw spectra. The corridor is cooperative. Our methods should be too. Replicate across teams. Independent trenches in neighboring basins, comparable sampling in upland and lowland, interlab comparisons for lipids and aDNA, all help us see practice rather than protocol. Ethical note: many uncertainties demand more sampling of bones, teeth, and treasured sherds. Communities carry living relationships to these remains and lands. The right to say, not here, not this bone, or share results in our language first, belongs with them. Where a question would cost too much in material or trust, we walk around it. The gradient we celebrate includes our responsibilities. A gentle correction we owe ourselves. Mosaic must not become a slogan that hides hard questions behind pleasant complexity. It is a hypothesis about patterned coexistence that should be tested valley by valley, floor by floor, and revised when a basin speaks differently. In a corridor of short distances and many options, we should expect exceptions that teach. A short field list for the seasons ahead. Upland station package, paired human-goat enamel transects, dung micromorphology with insect and pollen, vessel lipids from repaired pots, closely spaced short-lived radiocarbon dates. Piedmont hamlet package, dense flotation with 1 mm mesh, micro-botanical sampling from sickle gloss and quern shoulders, Bayesian phasing of resurfaced floors, aDNA kinship across 2 or 3 rebuilds. River margin package, fine mesh fishbone recovery, APAAs targeted to heavily suited jars, reservoir effect calibration using paired fish grain dates, geomorph coring to place dug areas in migrating channel histories. Corridor node package, pass or ford, petrography of traded pots, obsidian sourcing of cores and inserts, faunal profiles for feast signatures, high-resolution dating of pit episodes, ancient DNA for mobility outliers. Uncertainty is not a fog to fear. It is a night path we can walk with better lamps. Each careful sample, each transparent model, is a small lantern set along the trail. The gradient holds because people made choices that worked in stacked landscapes. Our work is to see those choices in their tempos and textures without smoothing what the land kept rough. In the next part, we'll return to genomes with sharper tools. Ancient DNA 2, diffusion, admixture, and outliers, to test whether fine-grained sampling can separate small, steady threads from rare, bright strands that cross the corridor in single lives. Let's sharpen the genomic picture without turning it into a mural of absolutes. We have already heard that ancestry in the corridor tends to be braided, local threads carried forward, new strands woven in. Tonight we ask finer questions. How did these strands enter? Slow diffusion by marriage and neighborly adoption, or punctuated arrivals that shine bright for a generation and fade into the cloth? Can we time mixtures with any humility? Do sex-biased signals hint at who was moving and who was hosting? And what do the rare outliers, individuals whose genomes look from elsewhere, teach us about the corridor's reach? Begin with a tool that reads time in genetic mixing, dates and related haplotype-based methods. When ancestries meet, chromosome segments from each source start long in the first mixed generation, and then chop into smaller blocks over successive recombinations. By measuring how block lengths decay, we can estimate when mixing occurred, broadly, and with error bars that respect small samples. Apply this to a valley where pottery and caprines appear in the 6th millennium BCE, and where individuals show a mixture of local forager-like and southwest-associated ancestries. In many such cases, the admixture time estimates center not on a single pulse, but on a period that overlaps with the archaeological thickening of mixed economies, suggesting steady contacts over several generations, rather than a single founding event. Where models do point to a tighter pulse, say, a cluster of individuals with similar dates for admixture, archaeology often shows a contemporaneous bump in hamlet density or a new rim style. Mosaic does not exclude bright moments, it frames them. Haplotype sharing, identity by descent, IBD, adds resolution within valleys. Individuals who share long IBD tracks were close kin within a few generations, even if they lie in different graves. Map such tracks across a hamlet's layers, and you sometimes see a family spine, grandparents in the lower floor horizon, cousins on the rebuilt surface, a marriage tie to an in-law whose enamel baseline sits across the pass. In other hamlets, IBD sharing is sparse. The community feels like a gathering of near strangers, neighbors who share practices more than grandparents. Neither pattern contradicts mixed economies. They reveal how social fabrics differed. Some places anchored lineages in one patch of earth, others assembled people season after season from a wider pool. Runs of homozygosity, ROH, speak to group size and marriage circles. Few long ROH suggest wide mate choice and larger effective population size. Many long ROH hint at small circles or close kin unions. Most individuals in well-sampled basins carry modest ROH, consistent with communities linked enough by paths and feasts to avoid tight endogamy. But we do encounter individuals with very long ROH, children of close relatives, rare and instructive. They remind us that choice narrows in thin winters and on steep shoulders. They also warn us not to universalize from averages. Sex-biased signals, mitochondrial DNA versus Y chromosome lineages, are often invoked to infer who moved. Use them gently. In a few valleys, mtDNA diversity outpaces Y diversity across floors dated to the same centuries, a pattern compatible with women moving more often between communities, marriage ties across passes, while men stayed patrilocally. Elsewhere, the ratio flips. In still others, both sexes seem mobile. Material culture can rhyme with these patterns, but does not always. A valley with diverse mtDNA might also show pottery pastes from many tempers, sizable feasting pits at nodal points, and more obsidian from multiple flows, signs of women arriving with vessels and recipes. The lesson is not a rule, it is the corridor's flexibility. Social contracts, bride service here, UXRI local residence there, fosterage somewhere else, change across ridges and years. Outliers deserve a calm spotlight. Every dataset carries a few individuals whose genomes sit off the local cloud in PCA space, whose strontium baselines point to childhoods beyond the immediate geology, or whose mitochondrial haplotypes are unexpected for the valley. When dates, enamel, and genome all lean the same way, we are likely meeting travelers who settled, spouses from a far basin, specialists who arrived with skills or ties, or families who chose a new valley after a flood or feud. Outliers teach corridor length. A person buried in a Piedmont hamlet with enamel signatures from a volcanic plateau 2 passes away tells us little about language, but much about roots and alliances. A rare case with affinities to groups farther south or west hints at threads that occasionally spanned multiple basins. What we do not do is scale the outlier up to a migration. One life can be a bright line without being a demographic arrow. Can we see echoes of practice, dairy, fish, fields, in genomes themselves? Not directly, and not in the way headlines sometimes imply. The classic lactase persistence allele, common in some later Eurasian populations, remains rare to absent in this window. Dairying here in the 6th-5th millennia BCE worked without adult lactose digestion, as fermentation and cheese did the biochemical labor. Pathway genes for starch or fat metabolism vary among individuals, but sample sizes and effect sizes are small. We do not draw cuisine from genotype. Where genomes meet practice best is through calculus proteins, milk peptides, and isotopes, paired individual by individual. A child whose enamel transect shows upland summers, whose calculus carries V-lactoglobulin, and whose community's pots whisper dairy. Together they write a page. Separate, each is a footnote. Population structure across the ranges looks like islands bridged by causeways that only sometimes flood. F statistics detect subtle north-south and east-west clines that the mountain's geographies predict. QPADM fits multiple plausible source-like combinations, cautioning us that ancient population labels are at best proxies. In some models, contributions that look Anatolian farmer-like mix with Caucasus hunter-gatherer-like, and later small doses of steppe-associated variation. The weights shift valley by valley and century by century. No single component owns the corridor. This accords with toolkits and menus. Multiple packages co-present, recombining locally. A word about cemetery structure. Where formal burial places exist, kinship networks sometimes line up with grave rows. In other places, individuals of varied ancestry rest side by side. Grave goods, modest beads, repaired pots, bone tools rarely segregate cleanly by ancestry calls. This matters because it tempers any temptation to equate ancestry with status or group. In mixed economies, belonging seems to have been performed through chores, paths, and feasts as much as through descent. Genomes can show us who shared grandparents. They cannot tell us who shared a net on a cold morning or a quern on a damp afternoon. Ethical note: second and third degree kin calls, sex-biased residence inferences, and outlier stories touch living sensibilities. We consult locally before publication, anonymize sensitive findings when appropriate, and present uncertainty ranges alongside tidy figures. We emphasize that ancestry is not identity, and that small samples, common in our window, should not be asked to stand in for whole valleys, let alone nations. Uncertainties, dates and haplotype clocks blur when coverage is low. Admixture times smear across centuries and can average multiple events. QPADM's source-like groups are models, not ancestors. Choose a different scaffold and proportions wobble. ROH interpretations depend on coverage and on thresholds for tract length. Small groups plus sampling noise can mimic close kin. Sex bias calls rely on uniparental markers that drift in small populations. Outliers can arise from model edges as much as from real movement. Independent baselines, strontium, oxygen, and context, grave goods, must corroborate. We proceed by triangulation and by reporting model sensitivity, not just a single best fit. Step back and look at the genomic cloth. Most threads are short range, woven steadily by marriages and neighborly ties. Some are longer, bright, and rare, carried by individuals who crossed passes and stayed. The weave tightens and loosens with centuries, but it never collapses into a single bolt. That genomic mosaic matches the kitchens, corrals, and weirs we have walked. Diffusion more than conquest, admixture as ordinary life, outliers as stories, not scripts. In the next part, we'll leave chromosomes for proteins and grains, methods and evidence too, proteins, calculus, and starch. To hear milk sing from teeth, plants speak from stones, and meals crystallize in places where bone and sherd fall silent. Some traces are so small they travel with breath. Others cling to the grit that builds at a tooth's edge, or settle into the faint sheen on a stone that has met grain for years. Tonight we listen to the quietest registers: proteins in dental calculus, microscopic plant remains on tools and querns, and the collagen fingerprints that help us tell sheep from goat when bones fall silent. Each offers a different angle on the same questions: what was eaten, how it was prepared, and who shared chores with whom, without asking the past to shout. Begin with dental calculus, mineralized plaque. In life, it grows where saliva meets biofilm, along the gum line, in sheltered corners behind molars. In death, it can become a vault. Trapped within its calcite lattice are fragments of diet, microbiome, smoke, and the everyday dust of a household. In the lab, a tiny flake, smaller than a grain of barley, is lifted with a sterile pick. It is gently demineralized, releasing proteins and micro-remains. For proteins, we use liquid chromatography coupled to tandem mass spectrometry, LC-MS or MS. The calculus proteins are digested into peptides, ionized, and sorted by mass to charge. Their spectra are matched to reference databases. When the fit is good and the chemical wear of antiquity, deamidation, oxidation, is present, we trust the match. What sings in calculus? Milk, sometimes. Va-lactoglobulin, BLG, is the star, tough and distinctive across ruminants. Caseins join when preservation is kind. A peptide motif can even lean sheepward or goatward, though resolution varies. Plant proteins appear as well, less often but tellingly. Storage proteins from cereals, fragments from legumes, the occasional seed albumin that survived mastication and time. Smoke's touch, a suite of heat-shocked proteins, can echo hearth life. Oral microbes round out the chorus, skewing toward communities we associate with soft, sticky carbohydrate diets, or, alternately, with tougher meat and dairy routines. We read these patterns cautiously, at the population level. Any one mouth is a life filled with accidents. Micro-remains travel with the calculus too. Starch granules, a plant's tiny batteries, arrive by chewing or by the dust of grinding. Under polarized light, their crosses and hilum shapes hint at identity. Barley lenticular and pitted, wheat more oval, acorn starch often larger, with broad extinction crosses that deform with heating, pulses with telltale surface pitting after soaking. Phytoliths, the silica bodies plants grow in their tissues. Add another key. Grass husk cells, bulliforms from leaves, globular forms from woody plants. In calculus, they nestle among crystals like confetti from daily work. When the same person's calculus carries cereal starch and caprine milk peptides, we glimpse a weaning porridge sweetened with curds, or a winter diet that mixed field and pen. Now, step from mouths to hands. Use where analysts take a replica handstone to grain for hours, then to reeds, then to acorn meal, building a library of polishes and striations. When they place a quern shoulder or a sickle insert under high magnification, they can separate the slick, invasive gloss of cereal silica from the watery, more irregular polish of reeds, the broad, matty traces of seft wood from the greasy sheen of hide. In the lab, we wash edges and sockets with pure water, then ultrasonically, catching the wash for starch and phytoliths. A sickle insert might carry barley and reed signatures in different zones, field in late summer, thatch in autumn. A quern's shoulder might trap barley and acorn starch together, a mixed cake's ghost. On a bone scraper that dressed hides at a summer station, we may find a few grass phytoliths, not food, but the bedding under a hide that collected grit while people worked. Each micro-remains tableau is local and small. What makes it sing is repetition across rooms and seasons. Zooarchaeology, by mass spectrometry, ZooMS, fills in when fragments are too small or too worn to name by eye. Collagen, the structural protein in bone, carries species-specific fingerprints after we cut it into peptides and read it on a MALDI-TOF, or LC-MS instrument. Sheep and goat, so often twins to the naked eye, separate more reliably in collagen than in long-battered morphology. That matters in our corridor, where caprines dominate many assemblages. A dump of metapodial splinters sorted by ZooMS can reveal a herd composition. More sheep here, more goats there, that aligns with pasture choice and dairy habits. ZooMS also rescues the tiny. A 1 centimeter rib chip from an ash lens can tell us whether a feast's bulk was goat, sheep, pig, or deer when cut marks have weathered away. Proteins extend beyond bone and mouth. Residue proteins can persist in pottery walls alongside lipids and, sometimes, skew clearer where fats blur. Heat-stable peptides from milk or muscle can co-occur with fatty acids, tightening identifications. Dairy in a vessel whose D13C leaned ambiguous, porcine muscle in a jar that carried little lipid but sat near pig bone heaps. On worked bone tools, collagen species origin can speak to choices, antler versus long bone scrapers, mapping craft to faunal availability. Tie these threads to individuals where possible. Imagine a woman buried in a piedmont hamlet. Her calculus carries BLG peptides suggestive of caprine dairy. Her starch suite includes barley and a few einkorn granules with heat damage. Her oral microbiome hints at carbohydrate and dairy, neither exclusive nor extreme. Her M1 enamel D18O sits in the lowland range. Her M2 shows a broader swing, and her strontium edges toward upland values in mid-childhood. A repaired upland pot from the same household bears dairy-rich lipids, and a sickle insert from the yard carries cereal gloss and barley starch. Played together, these instruments score a life. Summers high with goats, winters low with grain and mast, meals that stitch the two. Multiply such pairings across a hamlet, and we turn impressions into habits without raising our voices. Consensus is steady that calculus proteomics and micro-remains, combined with tool use wear and residue chemistry, have transformed our resolution on ancient meals and chores, especially in contexts where bone and macro remains are thin. Minority views warn, rightly, that contamination and overinterpretation lurk. Modern dairy peptides can haunt labs. Stray starch from packing materials can masquerade as diet. Collagen deamidation rates vary with burial, microclimate more than with age. These warnings are not barriers, they are guardrails. The answer is control and context. So, we build controls into the day. Field blanks, clean slides opened at the trench edge. Lab blanks that travel with samples. Extraction blanks that see the same solvents. Alert us to background noise. We track deamidation and peptide damage profiles to distinguish old from modern proteins. We prioritize inner calculus flakes over surface accretions. We pre-screen with FTIR to check for diagenetic overprint. For starch and phytoliths, we clean benches with hypochlorite, wear powder-free gloves, and run modern reference panels built from local cereals and mast, cooked as people might have cooked them. We publish spectra, micrographs, and negative results so that others can replicate or disagree with confidence. Ethical note: a flake of calculus is a piece of a person. We ask permissions, explain what we can and cannot know, and sample smallest first. Teeth cracked by heat or long burial are vulnerable. We do not pry. For tools and sherds, we prefer already broken edges and micro-sampling that leaves silhouettes intact. All images and spectra go home as open data, in languages and formats that local teams can use. Uncertainty box. BLG is sturdy but not universal. Its absence is not the absence of dairy. Taxonomic resolution for plant proteins is often genus level at best. Cereal storage proteins can cross-react. Starch morphologies converge with cooking. Boiling swells and blurs hilum features. Roasting can fissure acorn and cereal alike. Phytolith production varies wildly among taxa. Many trees make few. Zoo MS depends on collagen survival. Waterlogged or oxidized contexts silence it. Tool gloss can arise from multiple tasks. Only micro-residues and context break ties. Finally, micro-contexts are small. 2 centimeters to the left, a different history may be hidden. We answer with replication, triangulation, and the courage to say suggestive, not certain, when signals are thin. Stand for a moment at the boundary between mouth and room, stone and pot. The picture that comes into focus is modest and strong. Porridges punctuated by fish, curds spooned into barley, acorns leached and ground when fields disappointed, milks that rose with altitude and season, tools that crossed tasks without apology. Proteins and grains confirm what rivers and ridges proposed. Coexistence here is practical knowledge embodied, learned with hands and teeth. In the next part, we'll widen the lens to the sky, weather windows, mid-Holocene climate and choices, and ask how warmth, rain, and late frosts opened and closed doors without writing the script. Look up. The same sky that softens a ridge at dawn also sets the tempo of chores for years at a time. The mid-Holocene is often sketched as a warm, relatively stable interlude. But what households feel is not an average. It is a string of particular seasons. A late frost that bites grain heads, a run of wet summers that fatten meadows, a dry spell that lowers rivers until fish cluster in reluctant pools. Tonight we listen for those weather windows, how they likely opened and shut across the Caucasus between 7,000 and 4,500 BCE, and how people leaned into them without letting climate write the whole script. Begin with the big shapes, gently. After the last glacial cold retreated, temperatures climbed toward a mid-Holocene high. In many parts of West Asia, the interval roughly between 6,000 and 4,000 BCE is warmer than the millennia before. Ending disorder, but moisture patterns are not uniform. Westerlies wet the Black Sea rim more readily than the continental interior. Rain shadows and basin effects make near neighbors live different years. Lake levels rise and fall on their own schedules. Shorelines on the Caspian and Black Seas wobble. Peatlands breathe water in and out. If we could flip through cores from lakes and marshes along our corridor, we would see pollen bands thick with oak and beech in many piedmonts. Forests mature in warmth, while higher belts open longer to herbs and short grasses as snow lines pull back earlier each spring. Warmth here is a calendar, not a thermometer. More weeks of grass on the stair, more leaf on the mass trees, more evaporation under thin clouds. Households feel those longer windows first in the meadows. When the snow retreats in tidy arcs a week earlier, when alpine herbs set fat rosettes by mid-June instead of late, milk deepens and lingers. That invites bolder summer circuits, later returns, larger cheeses, more kids carried down. Dung mats thicken, repairs on upland pots multiply. In isotopes, children's enamel swings in broader waves of oxygen, catching the extended season at altitude. In lipids, upland sherds return dairy more consistently across consecutive horizons. Herd management bends toward the grass, slightly higher survival into a second year for females. A cull of young males timed to a late summer feast that thanks the meadow. Downslope, warmth has two faces. In years when rains come on time and rivers spread a thin, polite silt on fans, cereals do well. Barley and einkorn ripen together often enough to make threshing days hum. In years when warmth outpaces rain, fields thirst. Plants' close stomata, the 13C in plant tissues creeps heavier, and the grain heads that do form are small. Households answer by leaning on trees, acorns and beech nuts, whose roots read deeper water and whose masts respond to multi-year rhythms, not only this spring's generosity. A good mast year defies drought. Grease from boar and fat from nuts smooth the hunger edges of thin bread. In our record, that feels like a spike of nutshell and pit fills, a soft drift of acorn starch on quern shoulders, and a run of pig bones that tilt older. Animals kept longer to ride fat years. Rivers translate climate into edits and invitations. Cool, wet strings of summers lift discharge and scour banks. Levees break. Fields shift a few body lengths as families adjust. Fish runs can improve in such years. Back swamps brim with birds. In drier sequences, channels thread tighter and slow into pools that concentrate fish but challenge weirs. Easier spearing, trickier basket sets. APAAAs, the heated fish markers in pots, may pulse accordingly, peaking in stacks that also show low flooding silt in micromorphology, falling when floods smear hamlets and families choose higher ground for a year or two, cooking meat and milk while nets rest. Freshwater reservoir effects on radiocarbon dates can drift with these hydrologic swings. That is why we pair fish and grain in the same hearth where we can, letting the chemistry measure water's mood rather than our guesses. Forests breathe to climate as well. Warmer, moister Piedmont decades thicken canopies. Under deep leaf, wild plants that favor shade contribute to meals and polish tools differently than open land species. Phytoliths from leaves, spores from ferns, and pollen spectra in cores from near hamlet marshes tell that story at scale. Starch on tools whispers it at the household level. Under heavier canopy, hunting trends toward quiet paths, more small game, and ambush along predictable runs. In leaner, more open years, after fire, storm, or a dry spell, deer and boar move differently. Clearings offer browse that reshapes routes. Zoo archaeology hears this in age profiles and skeletal part spreads. A season's take closer to the hamlet enclosed forest, longer drags from deeper groves when edges open. Climate made them do it is a tempting shortcut that our corridor does not permit. What we see instead is climate offering options with different costs, and households choosing among them with the help of skills they already own. A late frost, Plant a short season patch from saved seed, shift labor to mast and fish, and send an extra cousin uphill with goats, because meadows care less about frost than plots. A run of wet years? Invest in small ditches and low bunds along a fan's contour, and widen the grain share in winter porridge while keeping a hand on the bell rope. A dry decade? Thicken social glue, more feasts it passes, more loans of kids and goats between kin, more traded pots that carry lids beeswaxed against evaporation. Climate is a hand on the scale, habit still chooses. We can anchor these sketches to proxies without forcing a fit. Lake cores carry pollen curves where oak and beech peak, then decline in rhythm with moisture shifts and early human clearance. Diatoms and chironomides in the same cores speak of water level and summer warmth. Speleothem oxygen isotopes in nearby caves register changes in precipitation source and seasonality. Charcoal influx in sediments flags fire regimes, lightning and people both, revealing when forests open briefly and when they closed. When we model hamlet sequences against such local curves, using wide priors so the math cannot bully the past, the patterns that emerge are reasonable. Upland summer stations cluster in spans when meadow windows were wide. Lowland, pit-dense phases coincide with calmer, resilting rivers. Mixed menus persist through both, but their balances shift. Consensus among paleoclimate workers in the region is broad on direction, if not detail. Mid-Holocene warmth, local moisture heterogeneity, forests full in many piedmonts, high pastures generous for longer each summer. Minority views emphasize sharper oscillations. Multi-decadal drought pulses, sudden lake-level jumps, and in a few basins they are persuasive. Our guardrail is scale. A 2-decade dry run can be every childhood in a cemetery. It matters at the scale of a valley's choices, without needing to be continental law. Where cores and speleothems suggest sharper swings, we watch for matching adjustments in toolkits, more net gear versus more sickle gloss, in residues, dairy versus fish pulses, and in mobility, enamel oxygen swings broader or narrower. Sometimes the match is crisp, sometimes people's skill dulls climate's edge, and the archaeological record reads steadier than the sky. Risk follows weather. The corridor's resilience is a portfolio, not a wall. Storage is part of it, pits lined with clay and bark, cheeses salted and dried, fish smoked and strung. Mobility is another. Short walks to greener tongues, medium walks over passes to cousins. Social credit is a third. Goats loaned and repaid in kids, jars traded and mended in acknowledgement. When a bad sequence stacks, 2 frosts in 3 years, a flood that lifts the hearth, a leopard's long visit, households cache these options in different ratios. In our layers, that looks like staggered rebuilds rather than abandonment, like mixed refuse even when one resource falters, like feasting pits that briefly grow bigger as communities redistribute from lucky to unlucky plots. Uncertainty box. Proxy correlation is not causation. A pollen downturn can be forest management, not only climate. Charcoal spikes can be kitchen, not wildfire. Speleothem, the 18O tracks moisture sources and seasonality more than rain amount. Matching those to enamel D18O requires care. Lake levels mix climate with outlet shifts and tectonics. Caspian and Black Sea shores answer to distant rivers as much as to local clouds. Calibration curves and reservoir effects can align climate and culture by accident. Our remedy is local pairing, site phases modeled with micro-context dates, proxies from the same catchment, methods that allow misfit without assuming error. Ethical note, climate talk is present tense here. Communities along these rivers and ridges live with floods and droughts now. When we share reconstructions, we do not frame them as destiny. We offer maps of variability and strategies that ancestors used. Diversify, store, move, cooperate, without romanticizing hardship or prescribing from the past. Archaeology is not a weather forecast. It can be a memory of workable habits. Step outside with the lamp dimmed. The air tonight is damp and smells of leaf. Tomorrow's sky may clear and push goats higher. In a week, a valley wind might come hot and flatten barley heads. None of that picks a single lifeway as winner. It rewards households that keep 2 trails open, 2 menus rehearsed, 2 kinds of labor taught to children who will need both. That is what the Mid-Holocene offered, time enough to practice plural competence until it felt like heritage. In the next part, we'll We'll gather the strands, dates, meals, paths, genes, into a long coexistence, synthesis without haste, and let the corridor's patient braid come into view without tightening it into a rope. Step back from the trench walls and let the corridor breathe as a whole. From the Black Sea's humid rim to the drier basins that lean toward the Caspian, from piedmont oak to subalpine herbs, we have watched households keep two trails open for a very long time, roughly 7,000 to 4,500 BCE. It is time to gather our lines of evidence into one patient braid, careful not to pull so hard that threads snap or colors blur. First, the calendar. Radiocarbon dates tied to micro-contexts, hearth rakeouts, resurfaced floors, pit fills, stack into Bayesian sequences that refuse a single turning point. Pottery appears and thickens across the 6th millennium BCE, sometimes early in riverside camps, sometimes later in piedmont hamlets. Domestic caprines show up nearby or slightly offset in time. The curve of adoption is lumpy. Plateaus in the calibration curve widen ranges, and rivers erase pages. But even after we account for these, phases overlap. Stone inserts with serial gloss share floors with netgear. Dung spherolites nestle in thin sections beside trampled phytoliths of wild grasses. Timelines here are braids, not baton passes. Second, the kitchen ledger. Lipid residues in pots draw a menu that changes with place and season. Ruminant adipose stews common in lowland hamlets, clearer dairy signals in small, well-traveled upland vessels. Aquatic biomarkers recurring along major rivers and lakes. Starch and phytoliths from sickles, querns, and calculus to add barley and einkorn, acorn and beech, occasional pulses and leafy edges. Proteins in calculus, milk peptides foremost, confirm that dairying joined the toolkit without the genetic crutch of later lactase persistence. None of these signals stand alone, but they cohere. Where enamel oxygen swings with altitude, dairy lipids thicken. Where the 18O stays narrow along a river, fish markers and wetland seeds appear more often. Mixed tables are not a compromise, they are strategy. Third, the body's maps. Strontium in enamel pins childhoods to belts of geology, mostly local with seasonal sway. Oxygen adds the water's memory of altitude and season. Carbon in collagen and carbonate shades meals toward open meadow or canopy edge, toward milk and meat or plant-heavy porridge. Human and goat teeth paired in the same contexts show families and herds sharing circuits, or splitting tasks when fields demanded staying put. These isotopic chords match the ground, dung-rich floors in summer stations, packed earthen rooms with querns and pots in hamlets, fishbone halos near weirs. A child can grow up in a narrow water band and still live in a household fluent in upland timing, because kin do and goods travel. Fourth, the tools and rooms. Composite sickles with microlith inserts work fields while nets and barbed points work backwaters. Groundstones sit shoulder to shoulder with pressure-flaked bladelets. Repairs on portable pots speak of travel along the stair. Houses remain light and round or softly rectilinear, rebuilt often, with hearths that tell multiple tempos. A steady simmer for porridges and milk. Quick heat for meat and fish. Pits store, cool, and sometimes host feasts. Yards gather tasks into zones where phosphate maps go and micro-debitage halos glitter. Architecture here does not declare an identity. It accommodates several at once. Fifth, the social glue. Feasts cluster at nodes, passes, confluences, fords, where big roasting pits, oversized vessels, and mixed provenance assemblages suggest gatherings that redistributed risk, news, and style. Gifts, obsidian cores from a plateau, jars with admired pastes, moved in short hops repeated often, with occasional long bright threads. Repairs stitched vessels and relationships alike. These ordinary mechanics made extraordinary resilience. When grain failed, a cousin's cheese-filled bowls. When floods bit, upland cousins hosted. When mast boomed, pigs and people both fattened and shared. Sixth, ancestry and kin. Ancient DNA reads neither language nor identity, yet it traces contacts. Admixture is the rule, continuity stubborn, punctuated arrivals occasional. Kinship runs through some cemeteries like a backbone. Elsewhere, communities look like gatherings of near kin and neighbors. Sex-biased patterns vary by valley and century. women moving more here, men there, consistent with flexible residence and marriage norms. Outliers, those whose genomes and enamel point to childhoods over a pass or beyond a basin, are stories of individuals and alliances, not the signatures of conquering tides. Seventh, the weather windows. Mid-Holocene warmth, lengthened meadow seasons, and matured piedmont forests. Moisture gradients split west from east and valley from valley. Households answered not by choosing farming or foraging, but by leaning within a practiced portfolio. Later returns from high pastures when grass held, more acorn meal and boar when plots thirsted, more weir work in dry years when fish pooled. Climate nudged, skill decided. Put these strands together and a picture emerges that feels both modest and strong. The Neolithic in this corridor is not a package delivered to a doorstep. It is a set of practices added to an existing repertoire and then tuned to stacked landscapes. Farming is not a banner. It is one column in a ledger kept alongside herding, gathering, and fishing. Herding is not a destiny. It is a seasonal grammar learned by feet that already knew water and mast. Foraging is not a residue. It is an enduring competence that kept communities solvent in bad weather and connected to groves and rivers that remain generous. Consensus and cautions belong in the same breath. Broad agreement holds that mixed economies persisted for centuries, that domesticates and pottery spread unevenly, and that gene flow wove into rather than replaced earlier threads. Minority views press for sharper inflections in certain basins, faster densification, more decisive drops in wild taxa, more punctuated ancestry shifts. We honor those cases by naming their localities and asking why. Geomorphology that favors fans over meadows, corridor nodes that drew settlers rather than neighbors, calibration windows that compress decades. A robust synthesis makes room for exceptions that teach. What then is the gradient in practical terms? Spatial, choices stacked over short vertical distances, fields within earshot of goats, weirs within a walk of querns, mast groves shading both. Temporal, seasons that reassign labor without erasing skills, nets in spring, sickles in late summer, upland milk in high summer, acorns in autumn. Social, roots that keep gifts, spouses, and news circulating, short hops often, long threads occasionally. Material, toolkits and pots that tolerate switching, composite sickles easy to repair, portable vessels mended and carried, ground stones heavy but worth their weight. Biological, ancestry braids that widen, narrow, and persist. Diffusion over conquest, with outliers as proof of corridors, not invasions. Ethical note, to tell this story, we have asked bones for collagen, teeth for enamel and calculus, sherds for lipids and proteins, floors for thin sections. Each request is a subtraction. The return must be shared. Open data, multilingual reports, and results offered first to the communities whose mountains and rivers keep these traces. Where permissions narrow, questions should narrow too. Respect is part of the method. Uncertainty box, synthesis grade. Earliest appearances versus earliest discoveries remain confused in unsurveyed basins. Missing valleys could shift regional firsts. Reservoir effects in fish-heavy places and calibration plateaus in key centuries still widen credible intervals. Dairy thresholds drift with herd diet and altitude. Local reference fats are essential. Enamel baselines age as rivers migrate and dust patterns change. Maps must be refreshed. ADNA models hinge on reference scaffolds. Different plausible scaffolds can serve the same corridor story. Our answer is replication, transparent modeling and comfort with ranges. If one sentence must carry the weight of these hours, let it be simple. Along the Caucasus corridor between 7,000 and 4,500 BCE, foragers and herders did not trade places. They traded practices, often within the same households, guided by stacked landscapes, seasonal clocks, and social paths that made sharing make sense. The gradient is not an in-between, it is a design. Hold that sentence lightly while keeping the scenes vivid. A repaired pot warm with milk on a rock ring at 2,000 meters, a quern's shoulder salted with acorn starch, a net stretched on posts to dry while a child taps a sickle insert back into pitch, a tooth that records a childhood across two belts of stone, a feast where a bead from a far plateau clicks against a familiar bowl. These are not metaphors. They are measurements, layered until they look like a life. In the next and final part, we'll pull back for a gentle closing, return to the ridge at dusk, and leave the corridor with a soft repetition of the lesson and a simple sign-off. Stay curious, stay calm. Dusk settles on the shoulder of the range where we began. The ridge is the same and not the same. Juniper keeps its slow, resinous breath. The river mutters below. Goats pick their way home as if counting stones. But you are carrying a larger map now, of seasons and tools, of lipids and teeth, of routes that braided fields and meadows, nets and querns, kin and gifts. It is time to set the bundle down, fold it without creases, and leave the corridor as lightly as we entered it. Stand where two paths split, one up toward grass still lit at the tips, one down toward a fan where a Yikturmdish hearth is already thinking of dinner. Behind you lies a calendar written in small things, a sickle insert reseeded with warm pitch, a quern shoulder salted with acorn starch, a sherd whose inner wall keeps the faint diary of simmered milk, a child's molar that recorded winter water and summer snowmelt in a quiet rhythm of oxygen. In front of you are the same choices that carried us through: climb, descend, or linger and listen. The land says all three are reasonable. This is a corridor of patience, not proclamations. Between roughly 7,000 and 4,500 BCE, households along these ridges and rivers did not line up behind banners called forager or farmer. They learned both grammars and spoke them as weather, kin, and time advised. Fields leaned on fans newly refreshed by silt. Mast pulled hands into shade when rain forgot to fall. Fish stacked in backwaters when channels thinned. Goats found the herbs that turned grass into milk and milk into saleable days. Archaeology hears this in evidence that refuses to march. Mixed residues in pots, overlapping toolkits, dung in summer stations beside nutshell in the same thin section. Bones that speak of herds and hunt in the same pit. The lesson is not a slogan, it is a habit. Keep options open, learn more than one path. We have been careful with certainty. Radiocarbon sits inside calibration plateaus. Freshwater reservoir effects bend clocks along lively rivers. Pottery and domesticates appear in lumpy curves, not tidy waves. We held the numbers by their proper edges, short-lived samples, micro-contexts, outlier models, and let Bayesian timelines braid facts into sequences that respect floors and fires. Where the river edited too hard, we admitted silence. Where a method whispered rather than sang, lipids, calculus, zoo-ms, enamel, we made it sing with a chorus or kept it a hum. The corridor rewards humility. It punishes swagger. People are the thread that made the braid strong. Feasts at passes redistributed luck and news. Gifts moved in short hops that added up to long arcs. Repairs on vessels were as much social maintenance as material. Ancient DNA traced kin across floors and cousins across passes, without pretending to carry languages in its code. Continuity anchored valleys, admixture stitched edges, outliers told stories of individuals rather than armies. The corridor was not a gate that opened once. It was a walkway used so often that it became a way of being. If we look for a single image to remember, let it be a low room at evening. The quern is still warm at its palm-worn curve. A net dries on posts just outside. A child taps a microlith back into its sickle bed, while a dog watches with half an eye. On the fire, a pot with two old repairs clinks, where simmer rises and falls, grain and greens, perhaps a little meat, perhaps a spoon of curd. The door stands open to air that smells of leaf and smoke, and a sweetness that could be beeswax or simply a year that has gone kindly. This is not a scene of in-between. It is a complete life that includes more than one way to make tomorrow work. What remains unresolved? Enough to keep the lamps lit for years. Some basins will yet show sharper inflections, fast densification, sudden drops in wild taxa, brief pulses of new ancestry. Some high shelves will hide stations that change our sense of early dairying's spread. Some rivers will still surprise us with edits we misread until cores and thin sections set the record straight. The point of a gradient is not that everything is middled, it is that edges are near enough to learn from one another quickly. Our task is to add careful cases to the map, not to flatten it with the comfort of generalities. Ethical care walks with us out of the valley. Every dataset here, collagen, enamel, calculus, sherd powder, floor-thin section, was borrowed against a ledger we owe to living communities and to the dead. We answered with permits, small samples, open data, and reports written for local eyes first. We let no shape our questions when it needed to. Heritage is not a quarry, it is a conversation. The corridor's lesson about sharing applies to knowledge, too. If you listen, the night offers a last set of sounds. Goats knocking gently horn to horn in a pen, a string of fish ticking at a rack as cooling air shrinks skin, a soft grind of stone as someone finishes a last handful of flour in wan light. The distant bell of a cousin's camp higher on the shoulder, comforting because it means another household is there to trade milk tomorrow for grain next week, or news for help, or simply a greeting on the path. The gradient is audible, alternate notes that harmonize. Take one slow breath, in, out. Let the map you built settle into a shape you can carry. Ridges stacked over fields, passes stitching basins, rivers editing as they gift. Houses light on the land, feasts at nodes, kin as thread. Keep space in that map for uncertainty and for future finds that will complicate without breaking what is sturdy. When you next hear someone tell the clean story, farmers replacing foragers in a single sweep, you will have a ridge's worth of details to offer in return. Gently. Two paths are visible, and they were walked together for a very long time. Before we close, a small invitation. If this slow, evidence-first way of traveling felt good, if it helped you sleep or kept you company in a kitchen or a car, consider sharing it, rating it, or telling us when and how you listen. We'll keep timestamps in the description so you can wander back to any shelf of the corridor when you like. Now, step off the ridge without hurry. The paths will still be here in the morning, and the past will still be patient. Stay curious, stay calm.